This first 20 minutes have been allocated to check-in and networking. Make sure that you sign in for today's wellness workshop. There is a QR code on your screen, and there's also a link in your chat box that'll allow you to sign in, particularly if you need CEUs. Absolutely make sure that you get signed in today. After you sign in, please update your display name by clicking on the participants button, hovering over your name, clicking rename, and then typing in your first and last name and the organization that you're with and clicking OK. In order to help us network, please type your name in the chat box and the organization that you're with and include the primary population that your organization serves. Also, please keep yourself muted unless you have something to share with the whole group. And while our speakers would absolutely love to see your face today, it is not required that you turn your video on. And you can also use the chat feature throughout the workshop today to ask any questions that you might have. So we are going to go ahead and get started this morning. Please be aware that this session will be recorded and made available through the website and social media links to inform and educate the public on this topic. Throughout today's program, our speakers may ask you to unmute or to answer any questions that they ask. Keep in mind, if you choose to participate in any identifiable way, you acknowledge that your image and/or name will be recorded and are authorizing the use of your information in the recording as described. You have no obligation to appear or speak in the recording today. You can turn off your video and participate under an alias should you wish to remain anonymous. The recording of today's workshop is protected by copyright law and is not to be copied. If you feel comfortable doing so, please turn on your video at this time. Welcome on behalf of the Wellness Alliance for Total Children's Health of Denton County, or the WATCH Coalition. It is our goal to work together to organize opportunities for professionals and community members to learn about specific topics related to children's mental health and to learn about the resources available in our community. We have many people to thank for our collaborative workshop today and for putting this event together. We'd like to thank the members of the WATCH Coalition for planning and thinking through this program, Cook Children's for providing CEUs today, and you, if you have attended a previous event, for providing feedback. That's what we use to plan these workshops, is the feedback that you provide, and we're so grateful for it. We'd also like to thank each of our speakers for giving their time and sharing their experience with us today. With their permission, we will post the slides from today on watchdenton.org. A few housekeeping details for you. We invite you to engage with the speakers and other attendees in the chat box. You can talk with the group as a whole or one-on-one by clicking the button next to the To field in the chat feature. This is located just above where you type your message. You can then choose to send individual messages to folks there. We will also keep the event open for 15 minutes after the conclusion from 1:15 until 1:30, so you can continue to network, ask questions, and share information about your organization in the chat box. Today, we will be discussing autism spectrum disorder, including diagnostic criteria, symptomology of ASD, and the differences of ASD from other diagnoses, as well as recent trends. And we'll also be talking about support and accessibility for those living with ASD. An evaluation link from today's event will be shared at the end of the program. Everyone is encouraged to complete the evaluation, and it is required to receive CEU credits. For your convenience, we have created an event packet for you to use and to follow along with today's presentations. You should have received an email with the link with the event packet in it. The packet can also be found on watchdenton.org under the Professionals tab. Click on the Wellness Workshop options and then the title of today's workshop. You will see a green button on the top of the page. Click on that button to download the event packet. Okay. If you need CEUs or a certificate of attendance, please make sure that you have signed in either using that QR code that we had on the screen or the link that is in the chat as well. Later today, those that have signed in will receive an email with a link to fill out that'll have an online evaluation for today's workshop. And there will be time at the end of today's workshop as well to complete that evaluation. You can print out your certificate later when it is convenient for you. Today's speakers will have no conflict of interest to report regarding today's presentation. Before introducing our first speakers, I would like to share with y'all just a little bit about why we do what we do. In 2011, the Watch Coalition was formed by a group of dedicated organizations and individuals who were committed to improving the total wellness of children and families in Denton County. Our vision is, because every child deserves hope, the Denton County community dedicates its unified resources to equip our children to reach their full potential mentally, physically, and socially to achieve their maximum personal success. One key strategy to achieve this goal is to maintain a diverse and active membership. We are a collaboration of both public and private organizations and individuals who are invested in the total wellness of Denton County's children. Our shared passion for improving children's mental health is the guidepost by which we base our choices. We understand the value of working together to improve children's mental health, and we are truly grateful for all of our members, volunteers, partners, and allies. Another strategy to achieve this goal is to maintain a website to serve the needs of families, health providers, and social service organizations. You can visit our website, again, at www.watchdenton.org and share this resource with others. We regularly work to strengthen the network of mental health professionals by offering educational and networking opportunities related to children's mental health, like this workshop today. We also invite the parents in our community who feel like they might benefit from attending these workshops. If you are a parent attending today's workshop, thank you so much for coming, and please feel free to visit our website where you will find resources, information about community events, materials from past workshops, and much more. I would like to thank Lori Holland and Rebecca DePeo-Christner, the Watch Education Workshop co-chairs, and the members of the Education Work Group for their work in planning this excellent workshop today. I can see by everyone who came and is in attendance today that this is a much needed topic for us to discuss. And I'm again so glad that y'all are here. I am now pleased to introduce our first speakers, Kelly Nix, Lauren Taylor, and Jade Marth, who we are so thankful that they shared their time and expertise with us today. Kelly Nix has a bachelor's in child development from TWU and a master's in rehabilitation counseling from UNT. She is a certified rehabilitation counselor, a CRC, and recently became licensed professional counselor associate under the direction of Rashida Sharma, PhD, LPC supervisor, CRC. She is a senior program project coordinator in the UNT WISE education program, which supports neurodivergent students in academics and gainful employment. Kelly has 14 years experience combined working with adults with disabilities in early intervention. Lauren Taylor is a graduate of the UNT Master's Level Rehabilitation Counseling Program. She is currently employed at UNT Engage as a senior program project coordinator, where she works with neurodivergent students to adjust to and navigate college. Lauren is also a leader for the nonprofit To Be Like Me, a program run by people of all disabilities designed to educate today's youth and community about disabilities. Lauren was born with muscular dystrophy and has been a full-time power chair since the age of 3. Alongside her service dog, Buchanan, from Canine Companions, Lauren is an all-around advocate for people with disabilities and specifically educates people about the importance of universal design and service dogs. In 2019, Lauren was crowned Miss Wheelchair Texas, an advocacy title that allowed her to travel the state of Texas to educate on and advocate for her platform of universal design. Lauren was appointed to the Texas Board of Architectural Examiners this year and will be serving as the disabilities representative to ensure accessibility everywhere. Jade Marth is serving as a Senior Project Program Coordinator for the UNT WISE Engage program, where their team supports UNT's neurodivergent student population with their academics and employment. Jade has worked in higher education for over 5 years with autistic adults and children for 3 to 4 years. Jade's undergraduate experience included earning an Associate of Science from Tyler Junior College, Bachelor of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis from the University of North Texas, and a Master's in Education in Higher Education Administration and Policy Leadership. Jade has enjoyed learning about the difference in approaches to supporting neurodivergent students in a variety of settings. As a first-generation student, Jade is confident the only reason she is where she is today is because of the higher education professionals and mentors who have supported her along the way. This impact has shaped how she shows up for students with the Engage program. Additionally, her education has provided with the useful skills to support neurodivergent students during their educational journeys at the University of North Texas. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for having us.
Hello, everybody. I am Kelly, and speaking with me is...
Hi, everyone. My name is Jade. I know we were just introduced, and then I want to go ahead and let y'all know that Lauren won't be able to attend today, so it'll just be Kelly and I presenting on today's topic. Thank you for having us.
Our learning objectives for today are to gain an understanding of what autism is and who the diagnosis impacts, identify and describe definitions and terminology associated with autism spectrum disorder, gain understanding of autism spectrum disorder diagnostic criteria, identify characteristics associated with autism spectrum disorder, identify presentation of symptoms across settings, and to define neurodiversity and understand the neuroaffirming lens. So, what is autism? What is autism, or autism spectrum disorder, or ASD? It's a neurodevelopmental disorder and disability. It affects communication and social interaction, typically associated with restrictive and repetitive patterns of behaviors. And in 2022, based on the CDC, 1 in 44 children were diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Why is it a spectrum? It's a spectrum because it constitutes a diverse group of conditions related to development of the brain. Abilities and needs of people with autism very much vary across time, across person, and the variations in abilities range from needing substantial support as identified by the DSM-5 or needing support. We love to say, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, and this goes to show why it is a spectrum. Again, 1 in 44 children have been diagnosed with autism. It is more prevalent in boys than girls. 1 in 6 children between the ages of 3 and 17 have been diagnosed with some type of developmental disability, whether that be ASD, ADHD, ADD. And 72% of 4-year-old children with ASD received a developmental evaluation by 36 months old. So let's go into some terminology associated with autism spectrum disorder.
Now we're going to jump right into common terminology used or associated with autism.
So an intellectual impairment, that's something that we see in the DSM-4 a lot more, but some in the DSM-5 when it comes to autism spectrum disorder. An intellectual impairment is a term that is used when there are limits to a person's ability to learn and function within daily living skills at the expected level. So if you look at typical milestones, where a child is throughout those typical milestones, it's typically a little bit behind.
Then you might hear the term masking or masked autism. This is also known as camouflaging. This is a common social coping strategy for adults with autism. This is when a person takes steps to avoid detection of their disability and evade intense social punishment that comes when you fail to conform to what is considered neurotypical or the dominant culture's norms. Autistics have noticed or have noted, excuse me, that this is an exhausting experience and it's detrimental to their overall well-being and health. And then I want to reiterate that another term for it could be called camouflaging. And then there's also an author, his name's Devin Price, and he has a text called Unmasking Autism, who goes into great detail a little bit more about what masking is and how that impacts autistic individuals.
Another term you might hear is sensory integration. This basically describes the processes in the brain that take in information, how we receive it through our five senses, and how we respond appropriately. So some, as we'll learn in a little bit, some of the sensory pieces of autism are maybe somebody's averse, like a specific stimuli is aversive to them, or maybe it's something that they are basically involved in repetitive motion with, so like rice or water, those kinds of things.
You might also hear the term Asperger's, or you might hear someone refer to themselves as an Aspie. This is a developmental disorder, but is now considered on the lower level of support needs, a part of the autism spectrum. Someone with Asperger's may need support with executive functioning and expanding their understanding of the world around them. They might need social support. But the one thing I wanted to note here is while you might hear someone refer to themselves as an Aspie or that they have Asperger's, it's no longer a formal diagnosis. So you won't see that as prominent anymore. And then the last term, which we're going to go over in greater depth a little bit later in the presentation, or terms I should say, is neurodiversity versus neurodivergent. The first thing I want to go ahead and introduce right here and now is the term neurodiversity was first coined by the sociologist Judy Singer in 1997. She actually coined this term to explain how she understood her and her daughter's experience with the world, and that she understood that it was slightly different from the neurotypical experience. Neurodivergent refers to people with neurological differences, and we'll take a deeper dive in a little bit later in the presentation.
So going on to diagnostics. This is basically in a visual representation, some of the areas that are pinpointed in the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for autism. So motor difficulties, communication difficulties, sensitivity to change. We see communication and sensory repetitive behavior, social impediments, which is not for everybody. Not everybody may have any of these characteristics, but it's some of the things that we may see. So the first criteria to be diagnosed with, so it looks like we have a hand up, and I want to make sure that we answer that question. Is it okay if we take it now, or should we wait?
Yeah, you're welcome to take it now.
Okay. I just asked them to unmute. Danica, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, hello?
Hi.
Hey, I'm sorry, you asked me about raising my hand, right?
Yes.
I had a question. You talked about Asperger's not being a formal diagnosis anymore. What would they be diagnosed in? I'm probably jumping the gun here.
No, that's okay. So Asperger's is not a formal diagnosis because what they'll be diagnosed with is autism, and then they'll be on the lower level of supports. And so when we go into the diagnostics, in terms of support levels, you'll see where a student that might have been diagnosed with Asperger's might just fall into the autism category, and they'll be in like whichever level fits that. And we'll jump into that too. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just checking to make sure we don't have any other questions.
Thanks for catching that.
Yeah. Okay, so the first diagnostic criteria is persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts as manifested by all of the following. So that's either right now or it's historically. So deficits in social emotional reciprocity. So if I see somebody who's crying, am I responding in a empathetic manner? Am I maybe crying with them, or am I just, I don't even see them, I'm not reacting in that same way. It's also communication wise, right? So if I'm having an A/B conversation, it may just be me saying something to the person and they're not responding. The second criteria, or the second deficit, is in nonverbal communicative behaviors used in social interactions. Maybe, again, looking away, maybe not making eye contact, maybe not even being in proximity to other people that are in a group. And the third one is deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. And this is a bit more complex, but you see it from when they're younger, maybe not necessarily emotionally bonding with those around them, their siblings, their families. And then you see it later on in life when they're starting to develop friendships and relationships. The second is restricted, repetitive behaviors, patterns of behaviors, interests, or activities as manifested by at least two of the following. So criteria A, you have to have all three, and then B, you have at least two of them. So the first one is stereotypes or repetitive motor movements, use of objects, or speech motor stereotypies. And that is basically maybe saying the same thing. Maybe it's doing the same movements. Again, picking up rice and letting it fall through their hands multiple times. Maybe it's saying the same thing that somebody else is saying, echoing. The second one is insistence on sameness and flexible adherence to routines or ritualized patterns of verbal or nonverbal behavior. So again, not changing up any routine. I know exactly what I want to do. I know this is the plan. It may, in the workforce, it may look like they've learned how to fold towels, but now they're learning a different way to fold towels, and that's not right. And so it's a very fixed set of patterns or sameness. Everything is in the same order. We're not moving things around physically in our environment. The third one is highly restricted fixated interests that are considered abnormal in intensity or focus. So maybe that is, I am thinking about trains and only trains, or maybe I am reading only about history and I'm actively learning about reading articles and online and attending classes that are just history related. Obviously, you know, from a collegiate level, that doesn't necessarily happen, but unless they're in that major, but it's very, the conversations are very related to their restricted interests or fixated interests. You might see this in AB conversations where somebody may say, hey, how's your day going? And then they talk about, you know, what they're interested in, talking about that, maybe that specific subject, and the conversation's just kind of there. The fourth one is hyper or hypo reactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. So maybe it's, again, going back to water. I worked with children that would not go anywhere near water, but then I had some children that it was, you couldn't get them away from the water table. And so it may be a very extreme form. Maybe they get dirt on their hands, and that's not okay with them. And so you get this large reaction for maybe a small speck of dirt. So it just really depends on that individual. And then C is symptoms must be present in the early developmental period. So when we look at typically functioning children and where their milestones are at, they may not develop, or the skills may not manifest themselves until later. And in social demands, it may exceed the limit of capacities or be masked. Again, that masking camouflaging piece marked by learned strategies later in life. So this is when we start seeing in adolescence and young adulthood that they maybe are putting on a mask to be able to interact with others in society. D is symptoms cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of current functioning. And disturbances are not better explained by intellectual disability or global developmental delay. I will note on here that severity is based on social communication impairments and restrictive, repetitive patterns of behavior. So going back to those two main A and B criteria, sorry. So this is just a visual of some of the characteristics. Please note that this is not a realistic portrayal of everyone. It's not a comprehensive list, and it's not, you know, these are going to look different between boys and girls, males and females. So back to what Jade was saying about the levels of support. So in the DSM-5, you basically are not put in, but the person is characterized by having the need to have very substantial support or support. And again, what this looks like at varying ages and environments and settings, I guess you could say, different places in life and development, these are going to look different. In some areas, somebody may need substantial support and communication, but in some areas, they may need just very minimal support. But the DSM-5 states that the level 1 requires very substantial support. So we're looking at severe deficits in both verbal and nonverbal communication. So this may be where they don't communicate at all. Maybe they communicate with, well, we all communicate no matter how it is, but it may not be verbal communication. It may not be, their nonverbal communication may be completely off. They may have limited to minimal initiation of conversation or response. So again, that calling their name, maybe they're not answering, maybe they don't even recognize that there's other people in the room. And inflexibility in the following areas, which markedly interfere in all aspects of life. So behavior, coping to change, restricted, repetitive behaviors. So level 2, they still require substantial support, but there are marked deficits in verbal and nonverbal social communication skills. So maybe they can have those A-B conversations, but it might be very surface level. It could also be prompted communication from somebody else. So they can respond to something, but it might be somebody saying, hey, you know, somebody just asked you a question. They may have limited initiation and abnormal responses to social situations, and inflexibility in the following areas that are frequently observed and that interfere with functioning in varying contexts. So coping with change, restricted, repetitive behaviors. And so level 3 requires support. So it's still support. Without supports in place, deficits in social communication cause notable impairment. These are what we see within the Engage program and our students that I see their flipped. I got this from the DSM-5, like straight from the book. So I may have to double check that, but I got it straight from the DSM-5. Are y'all thinking about the updated version? Anyway, so the support level needs, basically, they have difficulty initiating social interactions and may appear to have decreased interest in social interactions. And inflexibility of behavior causes significant interference in one or more contexts difficulties with organization and planning. Again, we see this a lot in our engaged students. We work a lot with them on executive functioning skills. So organizing their time, putting things on their calendar, knowing what to prioritize and what can wait for a little bit. The whole concept of time in general. When do I need to be somewhere in that I have to leave 10 minutes early before I get there? If I'm 10 minutes out, being able to have conversations with other people. But we also see some that just really isolate themselves socially, and they're very into their work and their homework and their own video games or whatever it is. But maybe that middle ground where it's, I need to talk to my professor, I need to go to the pharmacy to get my prescriptions. And flexibility of behavior causes significant interference in one or more contexts. So that basically is still us. I just said that again. So, but difficulties with organization and planning is definitely something that we work on quite frequently with our students. So based on the DSM-4 vision, the biggest differences were deficits in 3 areas. So the DSM-4 requires that there be deficits in social interaction, communication, and restricted and repetitive behavior. So there's 3 different areas. Right now it's 2. They combined the communication and social. The second is there were 4 different diagnoses to explain one. So this is where autistic disorder, Asperger syndrome, pervasive developmental disorder, also known as PDD and OS, and NOS is not otherwise specified. And then childhood disintegrative disorder. So now we have 1 diagnosis and different levels of support. The age of diagnosis, so DSM-4 looks a lot at like school age children, but we are again moving back a little bit and noticing that earlier milestones that aren't being hit. This is why it's really important that early intervention is really important, especially because they have a developing brain and we need to address at a reasonable age, but also address anything that's going on so that they can be set up for success in the future.
Awesome. So I want to go ahead and talk a little bit more about this image. This image was found on Autism Sketches social site, and if you were to Google the autism spectrum and then just find an image, you would see multiple. So multiple people have created multiple variations of this same image. If you don't already follow Autism Sketches, I recommend following them on your socials. But I want to go into what this means and how we can look at the autism spectrum and kind of go from maybe an old or outdated view of what the spectrum means into kind of a more timely and understanding view. So you'll see that at the very top, it says autism spectrum is not linear. So it doesn't go from less autistic to very autistic. Yes, there might be higher level of supports, but that's going to be in various different areas. And so the circle or the pie graph example that's displayed today, you can see that there are social differences, interest, repetitions, sensory sensitivities, emotional regulation, perception, executive functioning, and then other things. And so when we're thinking about providing support to a person with autism or an autistic person, that could look different in different areas and how that impacts them and their life. So they might require a lot of social support at the very beginning of early intervention during their childhood. And then into adulthood and going into the collegiate setting, which is where Kelly and I work, you might see a little bit less social support, but they actually have more emotional regulation support there's required. The last thing I want to talk about today is the very bottom where it says terms like high functioning and low functioning are harmful and outdated. I think one thing I want to note is you might hear an autistic person themselves say that they are high functioning, or they might say they're low functioning if they speak in verbal communication. And I want to encourage you not to correct that. So as you're working with people at various different levels of support. We don't want to correct somebody in their experience and what they've been taught. However, when we're thinking about high functioning and low functioning, I want to provide an alternative for everybody today. So when we're thinking about high functioning, the alternative for that might be lower support needs. And so when we're thinking about low functioning, the alternative for that could be higher support needs. And then something that I want to go over is when you're talking about working with autistic individuals and supporting their success in various different settings, whether that's the community, education, at home, to be as direct as possible when sharing the type of support that a person might need. So that's why this pie chart is honestly like a really great portrayal of the different type of supports that autistic individuals might need, because it shows all the different ways that a person can be supported and how some areas maybe they just need lower support, i.e., maybe for executive functioning, but they need more social support. And then, of course, this goes without saying, but I'll go ahead and mention it. When we're speaking about people with autism, we want to avoid using condescending language or euphemisms. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and jump right into characteristics or things that you might notice with autistic people or people with autism. So this goes in alignment with what Kelly was reviewing with the DSM-5. So we have social communication and interaction. So you might see a person with autism or an autistic person make eye contact with another person, or they may or may not make eye contact. They might make too much eye contact. A lot of the times there's this potential where they could be, if they've been taught to make eye contact, counting to make sure they're making enough eye contact and focusing more on their eye contact versus the content that is available. This can often be misinterpreted as the person is not listening, when that in fact is not always the case or true. As Kelly mentioned earlier, an adult with autism, an autistic person, a child may not respond to their name. And that's something that can be taught over time and worked with, and to help support the student so that way they can be included via their name. And then you might see that an autistic person or a person with autism does not typically engage with what is considered typical play. So this might look like instead of rolling the cars on the floor, they might spin it with the wheels, or instead of having the bears talk to each other, they might line the bears up. And so we'll go into the very next slide, which is about repetitive and restrictive patterns of behavior. And that's where they might stack or line objects up. I want to note at the very bottom right-hand corner, we put here, because it is true, this is not a comprehensive list, and not every person with autism or autistic person has all of these characteristics. As we talked about earlier, they may not accept change in routine well. So this is a great opportunity for front-loading expectations, setting timers, having a visual schedule, presenting opportunities for practicing changing routine. So that way that the person that you're working with, the person that you're supporting, is set up for success in and across settings. You might notice something called self-stimulatory behaviors. This can include jumping, spinning, rocking, echoics, where you make multiple sounds with your voice, having things be close to your face so you can see them through all different types of lenses and perspectives. Another term or shorthand for that you might see is it's just called stimming. And so that's a very common behavior for autistic people or people with autism. And then, as we've already discussed, you might find that autistic people find different textures to be aversive. And that can be in what they wear, that can be in what they eat, across a variety of different settings. And so getting the opportunity to understand that person's boundary, but then also help them if it's impacting them in a negative way in their life. And then a couple other things that you might notice with a person with autism or an autistic person is they might have limited or restricted food interests. Like we've already said, they could have, that could be sensory related, but it could be GI related. And then they may not recognize or respond to safety situations appropriately. So this is a great opportunity to really practice walking. So that way, if your learner has the behavior of eloping, that you practice safely walking on a sidewalk in a place that there are not busy streets, or looking both ways, or practicing even just holding hands, things like that, front loading expectations, providing rationale, things along those lines. That way the learner is safe as they are going through the day-to-day stuff. All right, we're going to go ahead and jump into autism across settings.
So autism, as we've mentioned, looks different across settings. And in the home, it might look like having specific meals for dinner. I worked with a child that only had pizza from Pizza Hut, and it had to be thin crust, and it had to have sausage on it. And that was all he ate all the time. It may be engagement with toys, video games, etc. alone, and it may take longer to be potty trained. In a school setting, it may include, they may be included in general education for topics that they are specifically good at. I've seen a lot of students that are in the STACs or special education classes the majority of the day, but then they go to general education for like maybe art or gym or what have you. It may be where they're in kindergarten, first grade, and they go to group, like if there's not circle time at that age, but if they have like group meetings during class, it might be one of those things. May not interact with peers on the playground, and they may need modifications to curriculum. So it's modifications to curriculum, and then when they get to the collegiate level, it is accommodations. In vocational settings, they may need frequent breaks. They may need advance notice of changes if possible. So if their hours are going to change, or if they needed to work a different day, if their normal schedule isn't going to look like that, but you're going to have a training instead, they may need advance notice, but we also know that that's not always possible. They may utilize a variety of natural supports to get the job done. So maybe this might be working with a job coach to build rapport with a coworker. Maybe it might be a clock is positioned in a specific area that they're in so that they can keep track of time. It might be also the use of visual supports. In the community, tasks such as waiting in line or spending excessive time in one place may be unfavorable, or it may be favorable. They may elope or lose their group. So eloping is running away. It might be that they just get caught up in something that they saw that was really interesting and do not realize that their whole group is gone. And they may need help engaging with others in the community, such as if they are exchanging currency, it might be, here's my change, or it might be asking questions if they need help. It might be if somebody says, hey, there's something spilled on the floor, watch out. It might be avoiding those types of situations.
So earlier we talked a little bit about neurodiversity, neurodiverse or neurodivergent. I wanted to go ahead and talk a little bit more about it in our presentation. So earlier I spoke to Judy Singer and her experience coining the term neurodiversity. I want to go ahead and take note that neurodiversity is really an umbrella term. So it is not the equivalent of somebody who's neurodiverse or neurodivergent. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are autistic. So neurodiversity is a biological characteristics of a species. So for example, if all of us in this room have, different neurodiversities, some of us might have ADHD, some of us might have dyslexia, or in this Zoom call, then therefore we are neurodiverse. However, a person that has a neurodiversity is neurodivergent. So the person can be neurodivergent, but people are neurodiverse. The shorthand for neurodivergent is ND, all caps. The alternative of that is neurotypical. And so that's just explaining, like I said earlier, the dominant neurotype. And the shorthand for that is NT, all caps as well. And then, like I said, if a person is neurodivergent, it doesn't always equate to they are autistic. So being neurodivergent can look like having autism, having ADHD, dyslexia, OCD, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, and Tourette's. Oftentimes you might find that a person is diagnosed with autism, and that's all that they were diagnosed with, but you also might find that they are diagnosed with autism and ADHD, or autism and dyslexia, and so they have diagnosis. They're doubly diagnosed or triply. And we'll talk a little bit more about that with somebody that I'll bring up a little bit later. So we're going to go ahead and move over into neurodiversity affirming lens.
When a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower, by Alexander Den Heijer.
So when we're thinking about working with a person with autism or an autistic person, autistic people will do a really good job of setting boundaries for what they want, and it may look different than maybe a neurotypical person does. And so listening to those boundaries, changing the environment to accommodate the person and their needs and their sensory needs and all those things. So thank you for adding that quote. Okay, so, but I do want to go into, as we're looking at neurodiversity affirming lens, what language should we use? I think this is a good transition point. So there's two main variations, and then there's a third one that I'm going to present today. The first one you've probably heard a lot in K through 12 educational settings, and it's a lot of the times what people are taught because it's thought to be as really, really respectful. And so that is person first language. So you might say person with autism. The second variation is identity first language. An example of that is autistic person, meaning the person is their identity. So I want to note that person first language, person with autism, likely taught in K through 12 settings, has some really, really great historical roots, but identity first language has been kind of the new variation that autistic people are taking back their identity, their disability, and they're more closely identifying with their diagnosis of autism, and they're very much understanding that that's part of who they are and their experience with the world. And that's why a lot of autistic people will potentially prefer identity first language. One thing I want to note is that you might see this change over time, and that has to do with their disability identity development, how much they are relating to their diagnosis or their disability. So then the third variation that I want to talk about today is just person-centered language. Get to know the individual. If you're working with a child, get to know their parents and their preferences for the language to be used and what resonates for them and their experience. Does this look like the parent saying, oh, my child has autism, which would be considered person first language, and then talking to the child when they maybe do have verbal language and hearing the child say autistic person, and then transitioning back and forth between the two to really benefit both parties involved, but keep the child or the person with the disability at the core of what we're doing. Okay, some more things to keep in mind rather, when thinking about neurodiversity affirming lens. I want to start with aiming to understand. So in thinking about all of the things that we've learned so far about the autistic experience and the sensory sensitivities and other different ways that people with autism experience the world around them, really coming from a place of understanding can be the first step in being supportive to that individual. The second thing, when you're thinking about being affirming for neurodiverse individuals is to provide options. So examples of this in my setting looks like, do you want to sit here or there? Do you want the door opened or closed? Do you want to meet in my office, or would you like to meet somewhere else on campus? So providing different options, that way that the person that you're working with has the autonomy to make a choice that feels right for them, but you can still get the things that you need to get done with that person. Provide time for breaks, being very intentional about autistic people. One thing that they need a lot of support in potentially is self-advocacy. So being intentional about building in breaks, which y'all have done a fantastic job, Mandy, today with the break that y'all have built into the schedule, can be really helpful for supporting and thinking about neurodiverse individuals that need additional support with self-advocacy. Being mindful of sensory experiences. So that can include things that are too loud, that can include things that are too bright, too smelly. If there's going to be a fire drill going on, front loading expectations or front loading communication about, hey, this is what's likely to be going on. So that way that person can make decisions that's best for them and their sensory needs. If you can't do that, providing earplugs or headphones, light covers. So if you have very bright fluorescent lights, light covers, making it a little bit warmer, having open windows as opposed to bright fluorescent lights could be useful alternatives, or even just the option to close the windows. But that goes back to our providing options. The next thing on the slide that I want to talk about is breaking down materials and scaffolding materials. So this is a great example of what not to do with my slide that I'm presenting today. So ideally, if you were to break down materials and scaffold materials, you would put 2 or 3 bulletin points on a slide and then have some comprehension checks. So that's where I could go in and say, what does aim to understand mean? If we were to provide options, what does that look like on one slide? And then go in and do a quick comprehension check to ensure that the person understood it. I also forgot to mention earlier, providing options can mean even like, do you want to read this independently or do you want to read it with me? And that can be a little bit more relevant to potentially adults that you're working with as opposed to kiddos who are still learning how to read and things like that. Leave a little bit more time for processing and responding. Good rule of thumb here is that when you ask a question or you present a task to be completed, count in your head 6 to 8 Mississippis. So what is your name? 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 4 Mississippi, 5 Mississippi, 6 Mississippi, 7 Mississippi, 8 Mississippi. What do people call you? Changing potentially what you said in case they didn't understand it the first time, to allow them to respond with a response. And then if you're working with other supports and you're finding that maybe they don't know how to answer the question, what is your name? That could be changing and allowing for prompting to occur, and then giving them the option, and then still giving them time to respond appropriately, or what might be deemed appropriately. Providing visuals. So if you're asking an autistic person to complete a task, this could look like providing visuals in the form of examples. So that way they can see exactly what they're doing and what that might look like. In an educational setting, this might look like providing an example of what an essay looks like so that they can see, or the formatting of it. They can get an idea of what are the expectations in order to be successful. Providing reminders. Something I want to note when you're providing reminders is it's great to provide a reminder. It's even better to provide a reminder in multiple different formats. So at the end of our meetings, I might provide a verbal reminder. I might also provide a physical reminder in the form of a piece of paper or a sticky note or something that they can physically take with them. And then I might also send an email reminder or give them a call, depending on what the person's preference is and what they need and what's going to support their success, and then fade that out over time so that they can then set and be responsible for setting their own reminders to build in that self-determination and self-advocacy. State implicit information explicitly. So, if you're working in my lens is education. So if you're working in an educational setting, instead of assuming that everyone's going to push in their chair, explicitly stating like, please push in your chair, of course, act, with kindness. If there's a part for people to write their names on the paper, still noting like, go ahead and first write your name down. So if you were to mix it up or things like that, this can be extremely helpful in social settings as well. Like if you're going to a community location, going through and saying, hey, we're going to stand in this line, or we need to stand in this line in order to wait for our turn. So stating that implicit information, which you might, know explicitly, can be very helpful to supporting a person with autism or an autistic person. And then the last thing I want to talk about is learning from the person you're working with and other autistics. So I'm going to throw a couple names out there and hopefully y'all can write them down. I'll try to spell them as well. We have Kaylin Parlow. She was actually on Love on the Spectrum. I highly recommend. She's a great advocate as well. She does a lot of really great autism content, as she has autism and multiple other diagnoses, including, I think, dyspraxia. I think that's right. And she also has ADHD. Temple Grandin, she's a great person to learn a little bit more about. Satoshi Tajiri, who's actually the creator of Pokemon. And then there's Haley Moss and Brian Middleton, who is a behavior analyst who is also autistic, or an autistic behavior analyst. So, and then you might have people that you work with as well that are autistic, and opening up the lines for us to, or people to talk about what supports that they need. So that's when we're thinking about neurodiversity affirming lens. Those are all the things that I have for our slides today. Here are our references.
Hey, Jade, do you mind going back to the level of support slide, please, so I can just make sure I clean that up a bit? I apologize for the error. I'm so glad that y'all brought that up. As I was going through the DSM, I was looking at the top block, but clearly it's level 3, so I apologize. So level 3 is going to be requires very substantial support. Your level 2 is going to be substantial support, and your level 1 requires support. And this is where, as somebody brought up in the chat, yes, your level 3 or your level 1 just needing support is going to be more of that Asperger's diagnosis. So just wanted to clarify. Thank you for your patience.
Awesome. And then I saw the request to put the names in the chat. And I also forgot a name, so I'm going to add it really quick. Hold on. Middleton and then Devin Price. These are all autism advocates and people with autism that can speak to different experiences in different roles. And Devin Price is in education, Brian Middleton is a behavior analyst, Haley Moss, I think she's in business. Oops, and it's Haley, not.
Yes, she's a lawyer.
Thank you. Yeah. Satoshi Tajiri. Yeah. And I might have spelled some names wrong, but yes, those are all the folks that you might be able to get some additional information from. That's all of the information we have today. So I wanted to open up the floor. I'm not really sure if there's opportunity for questions, or it might be actually, I think we're going into a break. But if not, thank you. Thank you everybody for being present for our presentation today.
Thank you for sharing that valuable information, Kelly and Jade. We appreciate it. Right now, we are going to go take a break, a 5-minute break. And up next is Dr. Smith and Dr. Benners. They will talk about building up symptomology. But if you want to ask questions while we're in the break, I believe Kelly and Jade will stay on, so you can do it in the chat or unmute yourself. Also, please take this time during this break to sign in if you haven't already done so. We will put that link back into the chat. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. I'm now going to introduce our next two speakers. Amanda Smith received her PhD in school psychology from Texas Women's University. She currently works as an outpatient pediatric psychologist at Cook Children's, where she provides psychological evaluations and counseling services. In her spare time, she enjoys camping and traveling. Marissa Benners is licensed psychologist at the Cook Children's Denton Psychology Clinic. She received her PhD in school psychology with specialization in school neuropsychology through the APA accredited program at Texas Women's University in 2017. She completed an APA accredited internship at Fort Worth ISD and completed her postdoctoral fellowship through Cook Children's under the supervision of Dr. Lisa Elliott. As a mom of 3 children and a provider of pediatric mental health services, she is passionate about providing supportive and affirming services for children with diverse backgrounds and needs. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Smith and Dr. Benners.
Good morning, everybody.
Hi, everyone.
All right, let's see if we can get this shared. Oops, I did that wrong.
So, and just because we didn't introduce ourselves properly last time,
Yes.
I'm Marissa Benners.
And I'm Amanda Smith.
Yes.
So for our portion of the talk today, we're going to be talking about autism symptomatology. So what exactly does that mean? Okay, so we're going to look at autism prevalence, some racial, cultural, and economic disparities with autism diagnosis and treatment, the female presentation of autism and how that differs from the more traditional male-centered presentation, and how that can affect, again, diagnosis and treatment, the importance of early diagnosis, as well as differential diagnosis between autism and other disorders that have some similar symptoms and overlap. Right, so prevalence. Okay, so this was something that I was really interested in knowing because I'd never really delved into it before, but how is autism prevalence actually determined? So basically the CDC in 2000 set up this committee that has 11 sites throughout the country where they take samples of kiddos that are age 4 and age 8. They look through medical records, educational records, and look for either medical diagnoses of autism, educational eligibility of autism, or kids that have a strong suspicion of having autism based on the diagnostic characteristics. And then from those 11 sites, they, I'm sure, do some fancy statistics and extrapolate that to what the prevalence rates are theoretically nationwide. So they do that every 2 years, and that's where the prevalence rates from the CDC come from. So looking at prevalence rates over time, when we look at historical rates back in 1966, very, very few individuals were diagnosed with autism, about 1 in 2,500. And then we see once the CDC created that committee, we have more consistent statistics. And I didn't put every single one of them up there, but just to get an idea over the last few data collection points. And the most recent from 2020, which was actually just published earlier this year, the number is now 1 in 36 children age 8 have an autism diagnosis. So, there's a lot of debate over, why is the prevalence increasing so much? So I wanted to try to address some reasons that potentially can be happening. Is it that we're just better at identifying it now? Are more children truly, having characteristics of autism than were in the past? Those types of questions I think come up a lot. So, so the diagnostic criteria I think is a big part of this. So, how people think about and diagnose autism has definitely changed since the idea of autism came around 75 plus years ago. The people that prior to the 80s and 90s that were diagnosed with autism were those like very high needs types of individuals. Often they were institutionalized, so they were not seen by the general public. So really people knew very little about autism, or the ones that did really knew only the most, significant presentations. And then, throughout time, particularly starting in the 1990s, the diagnostic criteria has actually kind of broadened. So that's allowed people that previously either may not have been diagnosed with autism or may have been diagnosed with something else, but really were more appropriately diagnosed with autism to be included in the category now. So just kind of a brief timeline going through since the 90s, some of the changes in policies that have broadened the diagnostic criteria. So in 1990, the US Department of Education determined that autism would be an area of eligibility for special education services in public schools. So that definitely affected rates of kiddos that were being identified educationally in particular. In 1994, in the previous presentation, they mentioned this, that about Asperger's disorder, but in 1994, they actually they brought in the definition of autism by including Asperger's disorder. So they kind of added that diagnosis. They were separate, but kind of considered similar. So that individuals that were diagnosed with Asperger's disorder typically did not have developmental delays or cognitive impairments, which sometimes can occur in individuals with autism, especially when they were divided out into two categories like that. In 2006, the American Academy of Pediatrics began recommending screening all children for autism during some of their well child visits at 18 and 24 months. So that's when we started seeing some more screening tools, hopefully with the goal of catching children earlier. In 2013, the DSM then collapsed the diagnosis of autism and put several other things under the umbrella of autism. So like we mentioned previously, PDD, NOS, Asperger's disorder, and a couple others were kind of all combined under the autism umbrella. So that increased the prevalence rates on paper of autism because those children were previously diagnosed under different criteria. And then most recently with the text revision of the DSM-5, they just made some kind of minor changes to the diagnostic criteria to make it more clear. Instead of, may have, they say all, just a few minor tweaks. Okay. All right, so other factors that can affect prevalence rates, increasing awareness of autism. So like I talked about earlier, back, prior to the 1980s, autism was not something that people saw all the time or that people talked about. And research shows that people that are more aware of autism's presentation and symptoms are more likely to seek out a diagnosis for their child than those that aren't. And also, having an autism diagnosis can give children access to specialized services at times. So that may make people that, children that may be kind of on the borderline of diagnosis sometimes can tip the scale to say, okay, they meet the criteria and so that they can get the services, whereas in the past, maybe they would have fallen on the other side of the fence. And then, also wondering about increased diagnostic accuracy. So it's an interesting statistic that as rates of autism have risen, the diagnosis of intellectual disability has actually decreased. So are we being more accurate now with identifying different communication styles? Some children are nonverbal, but that doesn't mean that they are intellectually impaired. They may have autism or other things that are a communication disorder, but that doesn't mean that they are not intelligent individuals. So just a few thoughts on those. All right, so I wanted to look also at some disparities with different racial and cultural groups, as well as different economic groups in both diagnosis and treatment. So kind of a upsetting trend, I guess, in research in autism. As we know, autism prevalence traditionally highest among white children in the US. Other racial and ethnic minority groups are definitely underrepresented in prevalence studies. So when people do research, oftentimes they don't even record the ethnicity of their participants. And a lot of times when they do, they don't even run any statistics on that to see if there's any differences. So it makes it really hard to try to generalize any of the findings across different groups of people because we don't know. Everything's been very centered on white males for autism research traditionally. So autistic children from underserved communities, racial and ethnic minorities, low income, kids living in rural areas, they're often identified later than other kids. For African-American kids, Hispanic kids, they're diagnosed at older ages than white children and historically. So the average age for most children as a whole is 2 to 4 years. For Black kids, it was 5.5 years in a study that they were looking at. So that's a pretty big difference, especially when we're talking about, early intervention. I mean, those kids are already in kindergarten before they're even getting any types of recognition of, differences that they need support for. Black kids are also more than 5 times more likely to be misdiagnosed with behavior disorders before being diagnosed with autism. And I think, from the research that I read, it seems like there's more of an inherent bias of just the records that are sent with kids, with Black kids in particular, have more concern for behavior problems as opposed to some of the communication problems or other discrepancies that we see in autism. So, if you get a bunch of paperwork with the kid that's, having a bunch of meltdowns and tantrums and acting out and aggressive, as opposed to saying, well, they're having trouble communicating and they're lining things up. I mean, I feel like sometimes practitioners go in with a very different mindset and maybe have some unintended bias. And then again, the rates of intellectual disability among Black kiddos with autism are substantially higher than white kids. So really, there's not a lot of research showing that there's any genetic component to that. They really think that it's more just the lack of early intervention services that are putting kids from minority groups kind of on a different developmental trajectory. Right. But, some argument, is that there's kind of a lack of access for some of, these underserved populations. But even when families had access to specialists, it took longer for Black kiddos to get an autism diagnosis than white kids. So there's still a disparity even when the resources are there. But, it says, however, widespread screening has improved the detection of autism. And I thought this next slide was really interesting. And I'm kind of surprised that more people aren't talking about this, because this was the most recent data collection from the CDC. And they showed that for the first time, the prevalence of autism was lower in white kiddos than in other ethnic groups. So there was a 30% increase in kiddos from ethnic minority groups being diagnosed with autism. So it's almost like, are we making a correction now for some of the kids that were missed earlier on? So, so we have the diagnostic disparities, but then, and that affects treatment like greatly. So diagnostic delays and barriers, they prevent access to, therapies for kids. They're not getting, speech therapy, occupational therapy, some of the things that they need for support. So, if families are having to pay out of pocket, oftentimes they can't afford that. So that's prohibitive for treatment. Sometimes families don't recognize the need. Unfortunately, in our, insurance-driven society, we sometimes have to have a label for something. There has to be a diagnostic code in order to access services and open doors for people. And sometimes families don't realize that. And then, I think all of us in healthcare know that there's longer wait times for kiddos that are on, more government-based like Medicaid products than there is for private insurance or people that can afford to self-pay. So that is definitely something that can affect the intervention for kiddos with autism. And then I'm going to switch gears a little bit and just talk about the female presentation of autism, because that is something that historically, again, another underserved population is girls. So there's a 4-to-1 ratio of more boys than girls diagnosed with autism. And it appears that about 39 to roughly 40% more girls should be diagnosed with autism than actually are. So, the kind of hypotheses for why that is that, there is a somewhat different presentation in females, with some more subtle discrepancies and differences. So girls are more likely to be diagnosed when they have, more kind of externalizing problems or more emotional problems, things that are, not necessarily part of the diagnostic criteria, but are problematic for them or for other people. And then it becomes like, oh, well, let's look more into this. And the trend really has been more for girls and women, especially women that have been diagnosed at older ages, going, hey, why was this missed? Why am I an adult now before I'm getting answers to these questions that I've always had? So, girls and women are more likely to be negatively affected over their lifespan because they're less likely to get the diagnosis and the explanation, plus the interventions and treatments that can help in the understanding. All right. So some of the factors that may be influencing later diagnosis in females. So like I mentioned before, just societal influences, lots of research on males, not as much on females. So the autistic profile of boys is much more prevalent. That's kind of the go-to when people think of autism, what they think of. Also in the media, there's vastly more males portrayed in the media with autism than there are females. And then, like I mentioned before, a lot of times girls' differences are more subtle. So they may have fewer early developmental differences than males. And there's more subtleties in their interaction differences where they may kind of be intermingling with their peers, and from an outside perspective, it doesn't look that different, but when you really look at their interactions, they are different. So, and oftentimes that doesn't manifest itself until adolescence or young adulthood. They're kind of able to use some masking and use some strategies to blend in and kind of follow along, mimicking things like that until social expectations sort of exceed what they're able to do. And then, kind of along with the research, the diagnostic tools were, validated on males. So there's not a lot of female-centered diagnostic information out there or tools to say like, oh yeah, this captures, girls with autism equally to boys. And the research doesn't show that because there is none. All right, so when we're thinking about, as I mentioned earlier, for women, some of the common pathways for women to get a diagnosis of autism or to seek that out to see if it's appropriate is also often self-driven. So they either have a family member or partner receive an autism diagnosis and then go, hey, I have some of those same challenges too, or I do some of those same things. Recognizing commonalities with other accounts by autistic women. It could be on social media. It could be, just hearing other people's personal stories. And then exploring the possibility of autism when they have, persistent problems in, getting and keeping jobs, problems with, their social relationships, burnout, things like that, where they're just, feeling like they've exhausted all other options. Like what else could, what could be the reason for this? Why am I facing so many challenges? So the research kind of shows some social differences when looking at autistic females, autistic males, and then neurotypical females. So what it generally shows is that autistic females kind of lie in between. The autistic males tend to have more obvious or greater amounts of social challenges, and then the autistic females have less, but are not as well developed as the neurotypical females or females without autism. So that, like I said, autistic females generally have fewer social communication difficulties than males. A lot of their experiences they report later in life are with social inferencing. So, there are some social skills that you can learn by watching other people or that can be taught, but the more complex things, the inferences like, okay, because of this in my past experiences, I can apply it to this situation and predict what might happen. So that's a really complex process and not something that somebody can just memorize or kind of fake their way through. So when they get to those types of experiences, it is a lot harder. Research has found that women with autism have more difficulty interpreting social situations. They had fewer and more intense relationships and more difficulties within their relationships than neurotypical women. So again, those may be some of the factors that then drive them to kind of question, maybe I have autism. Could this be something that's going on for me? And then looking more at girls at younger ages. So autistic girls tend to be more socially motivated than boys. So they crave friendships, they crave a social group, they want to belong. And again, this doesn't mean that all boys with autism don't. There's definitely a broad range of presentations, and there are males that fit this profile as well. So I'm not trying to exclude males. I just feel that females have been very much under-identified and deserve some time to be discussed. But yeah, so they attend to faces similarly. So they're maybe not making eye contact in a traditional sense, but they're looking at other people's faces when they talk, or they're noticing changes in their face and trying to interpret that and seeing, how should I respond to that? They're much more responsive to changes in facial expressions. And then again, they may display more subtle impairments or differences with reciprocal behaviors. That's like that back and forth conversation where maybe they are able to carry on some conversation, or maybe they kind of find a way to sway it to something that they're comfortable with. But when we look in just a second here at some of their interests, we'll see why that may be possible. So we mentioned previously in the presentation before ours, they did a great job of going over what masking is. So I won't redefine that again. But autistic females in particular use a lot of compensation and strategies of that nature to help mask their social challenges around peers. So research shows that autistic girls spend a significant amount of time, again, interacting with their peers. They're kind of in the mix, but it's harder to notice the challenges. But then when you really look into it, or really when you ask their peers even notice that something's different. They're not able to maintain mutual engagement as well. So things that involve like turn taking, imitation, joint attention, they struggle with those things more. And then they have sometimes more difficulty, aligning their behavior with group norms, especially if, I really want to talk about this, or here's my interest, and the rest of the group wants to do something else. It may be harder for them to say, okay, well, we can do what you want for a while, and then we can do what I want for a while. They tend to maybe be a little bit more rigid. And then research has even noted that kind of untrained observers, so people just kind of watching from the outside, don't necessarily notice these differences. But like I said, the peers are, but also parents report that the autistic girls are, like they notice that things are different. So they have self-awareness to show that I feel like I'm not fitting in and I really want to. So, there's a lot of consequences that come along with masking. It's really, exhausting for individuals that do this. And this is not just limited to autism. It's, a lot of people use these types of behaviors out in public to feel like, as an attempt to fit in or not to stand out. So, appearing more socially competent, and then, when the demands of the social situation exceed what they can do, they may do some unusual behaviors or do something that other people think, well, that was kind of odd, but then when they're questioned about it, they don't know how to respond. It's kind of a difficulty that they experience, because it does on a superficial level look like they know what's going on, but then their behavior doesn't always match. It definitely can cause more emotional problems, stress, depression, even increased suicide risk. Sense of identity, I definitely have seen this in some of the females that I work with, particular teenagers, where they feel like they've spent all of their life, kind of people pleasing, pretending to be somebody they're not, so that they don't really feel like they know who they are. And that's really distressing for them. And then it can also, again, prevent a diagnosis, because it is not as obvious of a presentation, and people think, oh, they just, they make eye contact, they can't have autism, or like, oh, look, they're going up to their peers, they can't have autism, when those things, that doesn't mean that they can't have autism. So then another area that research has looked into is restricted repetitive behaviors and interests. So this presentation is oftentimes different in males and females as well. So males often have more or more easily recognizable restricted and repetitive behaviors and interests than females do. So they're more easily noticed. Again, clinicians are more familiar with some of the male profiles, which are more movement-based. So that can be like hand flapping, rocking, just kind of repetitive behaviors in general, doing something multiple times. Whereas females don't necessarily have motoric things. It may just be the things that they talk about more often, or they have certain ways that they do things, almost like ritualistically, but that don't necessarily stand out as much. Autistic females may also have more sensory issues in comparison to males, some research has found. So while autistic girls are equally as likely as boys to have these kind of special interests, the restricted interests that they, kind of are really into and really enjoy talking about, they often appear to be more similar to what their neurotypical peers, female peers, would be interested in. It's the quality and intensity. So it's, a lot of, we'll say a lot of females like, certain like singers or something, but this, a girl with autism may be very, very much into the singer, I have every song that she sang. I watch all the YouTube videos about her. I talk about her all the time. So it's, something that is very kind of all encompassing, compared to, more neurotypical girls that can talk about other things as well and be more flexible. So I just pulled a few of these from some of the articles I was looking at. This is definitely not an exhaustive list, but just some examples of things that, special interests that are reported more by females versus males. So in females, a lot of times things like TV shows, certain people, so that could be actors, singers, kind of people, famous people types of things. Maybe like religion or politics. Oftentimes there's maybe like a strong sense of justice or like wanting to know current events and what's going on in the world, those types of interests. Animals, literature, music, whereas with males, oftentimes, again, not always, more interested in things like transportation. We think of things like machines, mechanical things like fans, vacuum cleaners. I'm trying to think of some experience from some of the kids that I've worked with. Car washes, so things like that, how things work, I think is oftentimes what we associate with boys. Also facts, so sports facts or different areas like that tend to be more some of the male interests. As you can see, the things that the females are interested in are more in line with kind of pop culture things oftentimes, so that's why it may be easier to blend in or harder to parse that out and say, oh, okay, so this is a restricted interest, okay. Whereas with males, it's maybe a little more obvious because it's not things that other people are typically as interested in. So some other diagnostic issues with girls. So again, research shows just in general that knowledge and understanding of autism is highly variable. So even, within professions that work with people with autism. One of the studies I was reading, it focused on psychiatrists for some reason, but it said, within psychiatrist training, they felt like largely underprepared, basically. So they said that 30% reported they had received no training in autism, despite the role that they play in kind of identifying autism oftentimes. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And then, existing screening and diagnostic criteria were largely developed from, again, boys and a long time ago. So, the more significant, substantial presentations. And like we mentioned before, the diagnostic criteria has changed over time. And I think changes are being made, but it will take a while to catch up to where we need to be with these things. So as a result, girls are less likely to receive an autism diagnosis using standard diagnostic instruments. So if we're looking at, cutoffs and numbers and data, it can miss a lot of girls because their presentation is more subtle and it may not be captured in the questionnaires and things like that we have currently. Whereas, especially with women can, talk more about their experiences and more self-report and self-disclose information that can really lead to a more effective diagnosis. But unfortunately, we don't want them to have to wait that long. We want to be able to identify girls at younger ages so that we can get them the support that they need. All right, so just briefly on kind of the importance of early diagnosis, just across the board for everybody. So I mentioned earlier, on average, children with autism are diagnosed between the ages of 2 and 4. But there was a study a few years ago that actually said around 9 months, you can start to see kind of differences in communication styles of kids that were later diagnosed with autism. So I thought that was really interesting and, something that could definitely help kids get some earlier intervention services because, the earlier we can help support and intervene, we can teach skills and help support kids so that they can be more successful down the line. That was just an average overall. I don't have the number for girls. The question, sorry, was, is that average the same for boys and girls? And I'm assuming that's the age of diagnosis. I would say not. I would say with girls, it probably is older. I don't have a statistic on that, but I can look it up. So yeah, at 9 months of age, kind of, we're starting to see differences in developmental trajectory. So even at 9 months, already exhibited some early social and communication differences. From 9 to 12 months, things like eye gaze, facial expression, use of sounds to communicate were different in these kiddos. And then by a year old, so parallelistic communication, so changing in intonation, inflection, body language, gestures. So all the communication stuff that isn't words. And then symbolic use of objects. So like being creative and imaginative with toys was different in these groups. And so again, it's not to say that these things are wrong or that that's, it's just something to note that these are different so that we can help support kids and get them on the right track. Because if we don't, the trajectory that they can go on can lead to some other difficulties, more emotionally, socially, intellectually, and we definitely don't want to see that. So, delayed or misdiagnosis puts people at risk of not getting the support they need. So, tens of thousands of social learning experiences can be missed over the first couple of years of life. And then if they miss too much, eventually we'll be on a different trajectory and have some other associated problems that are actually not part of the diagnostic criteria. So things like intellectual disabilities, language delays, behavior challenges. And so, and research basically shows that the cause of these is not autism itself, it's because they were not supported early in life to be given the tools that they needed to cope and be successful and prepare them for life. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Benners to talk about differential diagnosis.
Thank you so much. Okay. All right, so I'm Marissa Benners. So we at this clinic do a lot of diagnosis. We see so many kids who, are needing testing for autism. We also see a lot of autistic individuals for therapy. So I would say like, I don't know, maybe like half of the kids we see, autism is like at least a question. And it's amazing, since I received my PhD in 2017, just the changes that have taken place in our understanding of autism have been immense. Like it's been just a huge learning process. And of course, it's continually changing. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that diagnostic process, and then some of the problems that we have with it, and then kind of hopes for the future too. Like how can we make our diagnostic process more effective? So in terms of the path to diagnosis, oftentimes there will be a screening that takes place at the pediatrician's office, and they will say, hey, let's like get this kid tested, see if they have autism. And that generally takes place like within the first couple years of life, just because that's whenever doctors are really paying attention to developmental processes. However, we also receive referrals, from families. Sometimes they might see something as an issue that their doctor is not necessarily noticing, and so they may self-refer. So we can get referrals for testing kind of in both those ways, from doctors or through self-referrals or therapists. A lot of different places we get those. In terms of what the actual process of diagnosis looks like, it usually will begin with, a developmental history. So we want to get the full background of a child, and then we'll sit down with the family and do an interview. And this I put is a really crucial part of the process, because we want to know, just given like some of the things that Dr. Smith was talking about with masking, we want to know what the child looked like before they kind of learned, how to fit in with their neurotypical peers. We want to know, what did they look like during that early developmental period? We also have rating scales. We give scales that have lots of questions about different behaviors to parent, teachers. Sometimes there's self-report even. Unfortunately, with autism, we're very limited in self-report for kids. So I think that our scales don't actually start until age 18 for the self-report forms for autism, which is really unfortunate. And that is something that I would like to change in the future, because I think it's important to really understand the kiddo's own experience whenever we're making a diagnosis. Other portions of testing are direct observations, so what we're noticing when we're actually sitting down with the child, and then standardized testing. And I'll kind of go into a little bit more about what that is. I will give the caveat here that, given masking, the direct observations and testing are very helpful, but they're not perfect. So we will have kids come in here and we meet them and we're like, wow, that kid's definitely not autistic. But as you kind of get into it more, like you start to realize, like, let's put all the pieces together, that this may actually be what's going on. And that initial impression was not accurate. This whole testing process can really range anywhere from months to years. So it can be a pretty lengthy process because, there is very limited access in some areas to testing. We have people drive from all over the state to come out here, just because there's not very many providers who are able to provide this. Just real quick, I wanted to list some of the developmental screenings that are typically administered by pediatricians. I had mentioned earlier that there are some problems with these screening instruments. They are primarily focused kind of on that very early developmental period. So if kids are developing typically, and they have more of those like kind of nuanced social struggles, they may not get picked up by these screening instruments. And then they're missing that early diagnosis that is so crucial for intervention. And that's especially true with females, like, those very subtle signs. I've had so many families come in where they're wanting testing for autism and they self-referred because their doctor had said, oh no, like they're too social to have autism, or they're too talkative to be autistic. And that's a problem. Like, we need to kind of get rid of that idea that someone who's social cannot also be autistic. They're not mutually exclusive. I put this in here because this is a very big trend that we are seeing, is self-assessment. We are actually getting a lot of kids who are self-referred because they have taken tests online. So I just listed a few of them. There's actually much more than what I have here. And some of them have had studies that are kind of promising in regards to, the accuracy and the helpfulness in helping kids identify if they have autistic qualities. So I have this here. This is an example of the ASPE quiz. I took this myself, so self-disclosure, these were my own scores. So it's kind of cool because it will show like different areas and if they're more neurotypical or if they're more autistic. So it can kind of give kids insight on like, oh, these are some of the things that might be more autistic, and these are the things where I'm more neurotypical, kind of those strengths and weaknesses. I really like from my own experience, the camouflaging autistic trait questionnaire. I've used that in actually a few assessments with girls, especially because it gives you a good idea of masking. Like, is this child actually trying really hard to fit in, and are they mimicking other people? And just lots of that really valuable information about what their individual experience is like. So who can render an autism diagnosis? That's the next thing I had here. So there are kind of two different ways of identifying autism. So the first one is the medical diagnosis. And this will often be necessary if somebody wants to receive non-educational supports. So like occupational therapy, speech, just things outside of school. And the medical diagnosis can be rendered by pediatricians, and that includes developmental pediatricians, psychiatrists, neurologists. So physicians are able to render that diagnosis, as well as psychologists and neuropsychologists. So those are kind of the people who are qualified to give that diagnosis, that actually will get kids the supports that they need. Then there's also an educational identification. So that is through the school system, and it is based on the impact on the student's learning. So this is not technically a diagnosis, but it is identifying the kid in the school setting as being a child who has autism. And some of the benefits of that, just from having worked in the schools before, is that you actually get to observe the child and their natural environment. So the educational evaluation process can be really, really helpful in some ways. I feel like we're limited, like in the clinic setting, because we don't get to see what kids are like when they're at recess with their peers or what they're like in the classroom. So I think that's absolutely a benefit of getting that identification in school. Oftentimes schools will have a multidisciplinary team, which I think is another incredible strength about the school system. Like I used to work for Fort Worth ISD for my internship, and we had an autism team, which included occupational therapists, speech therapists, the LSSPs, and it was just so helpful to get that different input from different fields because, the occupational therapist may notice some things that we are not trained to pick up on, and same thing for speech. So I think that that's a really valuable thing about school systems when it comes to identification. So really quick, I'm not going to go into too much information with all of these. These are some of the tools that we use for diagnosing autism. And I will say that these tools are largely based on the male autism phenotype. So a lot of times they're not going to pick up on those really subtle signs that are seen in females. And that is a huge limitation of a lot of our assessment tools. So we do have autism rating scales that are specific for autism, and I listed a few of them there. Again, we use these in testing, but we are not going to make a diagnosis based on just, one rating scale or one score. We really want to look at the full picture. I listed the ADOS-2 here. So this was, back whenever I was trained in grad school, this was kind of known as the gold standard of autism testing. And more recently, we've kind of picked up on some of the problems that exist with this system. But we still do continue to use it. And I will say that a big part of that is due to insurance. A lot of insurance providers do require the ADOS to be administered. And even though we're not supposed to technically put the scores from the ADOS in reports, a lot of insurance companies will require those scores in the report. So, we, in lots of ways, that's very unfortunate that we are kind of governed by insurance companies in a way. But the ADOS is very play-based. So there's a lot of different activities that you do with kids, and there's different modules that are used for different age groups. So for older kids, adolescents, adults, there's a lot more conversation that takes place. But for the itty bitties, it really is mostly play-based. And you just kind of, you observe the way that they interact with you, the way that they interact with toys. And then there's a coding system that places the child in non-spectrum, autism spectrum, or autism range. And it also specifies the level of symptoms, so minimal to no, up to severe. So this is a standardized assessment. One problem with it, because it is standardized, is that we can only consider data that's actually collected when we're doing the ADOS. So we may see a child stimming at other points during the evaluation, but if they are not engaging in that behavior during the ADOS itself, we're not able to consider that in the scoring. And I get that for standardization purposes, why it's like that, but it's also, it's kind of frustrating for practitioners when we can't consider that. And so the score does not necessarily always pick up on some of the things that we notice at other times. The ADIR is more of an interview. I have not used this one very much, but one benefit of it is that it looks at lifetime and current symptoms as well. This really is just kind of a structured interview. The problem is it's less sensitive to identifying younger children. So it is best for kids over the age of 4. And of course, we want kids identified before then. So that is one limitation of this one. The MIGDIS is another autism tool. This one is pretty incredible in the sense that it really does try to get into the child's perspective, the way that they see things, the way that they feel whenever they're engaged in sensory-based activities. So it's really trying to see the world from the child's point of view, and it's more of like a less, or I should say less of a deficit-based kind of evaluation. But the problem that we have, again, insurance limitations, is that there's no formal score that you get from this. It's more of like a data collection tool. And so whenever kids are needing services, a lot of times this evaluation isn't going to, give the insurance company what they need to make sure that they're getting the supports that they would really benefit from. But I do think it's a great tool when it comes to just like really, seeing autism in a positive way and understanding the individual child. So as mentioned earlier, we will not make a diagnosis based on one test or score alone. We want the evaluation to be comprehensive, but we also want to make sure that we're not over testing a child. So whenever we have a kiddo come in who's referred, we develop individualized batteries of tests based on the referral question. So if someone comes in and they say their child is having difficulty interacting with others, they can't make friends, but they're also having trouble focusing, they're also feeling very anxious, then we're going to want to explore each of those areas just to make sure that we're getting the full picture of a child and really understanding strengths and weaknesses. And I included this graphic here because this is kind of, I know earlier, one of the presenters touched on this idea that autism is not linear. There's not very autistic to just a little bit autistic. Every person who has autism will have a unique profile of strengths and weaknesses. And so this is just an example of, one person with various strengths and then areas that are more of a challenge for them. So we want to look at these different areas to really, again, get the full idea of what's going on. So we have other rating scales that we give that kind of look at general symptoms, also executive function. That's a huge one that we typically like to explore when we're assessing autism. Intellectual skills, just because a lot of times we will see just kind of like a split between different areas. Like we might see very strong verbal skills, but then a weakness in like working memory. So we want to explore that so we can give recommendations that are individualized and will be most helpful for a kiddo. Also language, of course, that's a really big area to look at. And I listed a few other things here, but I'm not going to go into too much detail there, just in the interest of time. So diagnostic overshadowing, what that means is that, whenever a child presents, there may be kind of one thing that sticks out as a major concern. And in certain situations, we'll see kiddos be misdiagnosed just because whatever that big concern is kind of overshadows some of the other problems that may actually be explaining why that kiddo is behaving the way that they are. This study was really interesting. It found that there was a greater number of childhood diagnoses in an adult autistic group versus a non-autistic group. So it found that those who were identified with autism later in life had higher levels of ADHD, mood disorders, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress. So in a lot of situations, these kiddos were being diagnosed with things that may have been accurate, but they kind of took priority and the autism diagnosis was missed. And of course, as Dr. Smith mentioned earlier, there are other factors that probably contributed to those misdiagnoses as well. There is a lot of overlap with autism and other diagnoses. And so again, this is why we tend to do comprehensive evaluations, because we want the full picture. We want to know if there are other things going on in addition to autism. And I will definitely be getting into, someone commented about correlation with borderline personality disorder. And that's actually on the next slide. So good job. I will be getting to that in a second. So here are just from 2019 and some different diagnoses that do have overlap with autism. The rates for ADHD and autism, I've seen other articles that suggest that there's an even higher overlap between those two. But this just gives you an idea of that there are a lot of different diagnoses that we often see as comorbidities with autism. Okay, so here we are. This is the information about borderline personality disorder. So diagnostic overshadowing is particularly common with females. And one thing that we have picked up on as just kind of a mental health professionals in the community is that a lot of women were diagnosed with borderline personality disorder when they actually were autistic. So this was actually back in 2008, and I couldn't find anything more recent. I'm sure it's out there, but it showed that 15% of a sample of women with borderline personality disorder had co-occurring autism. And really important to note is that women who had both diagnoses actually had higher rates of suicidal acts and lower just kind of daily living skills. So this is something, and I have been guilty of this myself, kind of seeing borderline traits and focusing on those instead of recognizing where they come from. So if we're thinking about borderline, it really is kind of a trauma-based diagnosis based on difficulties with attachment. And we see that more commonly with females who have autism. A lot of times their interest may be in people. And so they might have very intense feelings about people, get attached very easily. And then when they experience rejection, it can kind of create this pattern that looks a lot like borderline personality disorder. And I love this graphic here because it shows, what kinds of symptoms do we see that occur with both autism and borderline, and then what kind of things just occur with autism or just with borderline. And I love these graphics because it can really help you pinpoint, like, is this both? Is this just one? And this Misdiagnosis Monday, they have a lot of other diagnoses that have the same kind of chart. So I find that incredibly helpful. Just real quick too, other things to consider is that, executive dysfunction may be attributed to ADHD instead of autism. Repetitive behaviors may be attributed to OCD. And that's something that I've seen a lot, where a kid is diagnosed with OCD, but in reality, it's actually more of a feature of autism and not necessarily OCD itself. Gender dysphoria too. I don't have time to get into that, but there is a huge overlap in autistic females with gender dysphoria. We see a whole lot of that. Other factors to consider, sometimes it's not autism. And so we have to consider, like, COVID, the lack of social opportunities, the impact of social media on social skills, and just general identity confusion in our overall culture today. So I wanted to touch on that because it isn't always autism. So again, importance of thorough developmental history. We want to know what a child was like prior to COVID, when they were younger. We want to know what they looked like. Oh, sorry. Yes, and I touched base about those graphics. So the different ones are listed there with the website. So I would definitely encourage you to check that out. So co-occurring medical conditions as well, they do very commonly occur with autism. So chronic pain, gastrointestinal issues, eating disorders, tic disorders, seizures. Another one that I didn't put on here is hypermobility. So Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, we see that often co-occur with autism. So it's just very fascinating. If you're seeing kids who have some of these things and they're also having social struggles, like, that may be like, hey, maybe we need to check this out further and see if this is actually autism. Okay, so functioning labels. POTS. So POTS is postural orthostatic tachycardia. So it occurs when people, whenever they go from sitting to standing or laying down to standing, they get very lightheaded and they might faint. So that's what POTS is, and we do see that a lot, especially in autistic females. Just kind of a lot of overlap there. So why do we have functioning labels? We have them because we need to determine support needs, but the problem is they're largely based on IQ and language. And another issue is that support needs can change over time. So a child may, whenever they're 2 or 3, they might be kind of designated as a level 3 need for support. But as they receive the services that they need, the supports, they may be more of a level 1 later in life. So it's kind of hard to say, like, yes, this child has this level diagnosis whenever it's not set in stone. And we really don't have a good way of determining, like, this is their level of functioning. Also considering, like, professional jargon versus lived experience. So someone who is given that label of high functioning may not feel high functioning. They may feel like that label kind of downplays the real everyday challenges that they have and the distress that they experience trying to fit into a neurotypical environment. On the other end, low functioning may make it hard for the kid to actually progress. Like, there may be kind of expectations set in the beginning of their life that they will never be verbal, that they will never be, that traditional view of smart, and that may kind of, like, prevent them from receiving opportunities to change that. The level system is also flawed because, someone may need lots of support in their communication, but not so much in other areas. So there have been times where I'll say, like, they have level 1 in their social communication skills, but level 2 in restricted interest repetitive behaviors. So it's not perfect, but we use it, again, because we want to make sure that we're doing what we need to do to get kids intervention. Oh, I'm so sad I don't have time to go into this. I will encourage all of you to look into pathological demand avoidance. This is a topic that is very big overseas, and it's kind of starting to trickle into the United States. Some people see it as kind of like an autism subtype, but I think the general professional view right now is that it really is more of a profile that often co-occurs with autism as well as other diagnoses. And so I'm not going to go into that because this could honestly be an entire presentation. But when you're working with people who have autism, I think it's important to be aware of this concept of demand avoidance, and that this is where a lot of like oppositional behaviors often come from. Okay, so is self-diagnosis valid? This is a huge topic of debate online, and there's this huge concern about gatekeeping a neurotype. So if autism is just a brain difference, a different way of experiencing the world, then who are we to determine whether somebody has a different neurotype, because it's part of who they are. And some of the benefits of self-diagnosis is, there are actual barriers to diagnoses, especially for adults. There are very, very limited providers who provide evaluation services for adults. There's also money constraints, time constraints, the executive function skills that go into actually making appointments, finding someone, and then just like fear of not being taken seriously. There's been, whenever people have grown up with autism, they have kind of learned to be invalidated in a lot of what they do. And so that fear is very real and valid and something to consider. I included this article that talks about the lost generation. So this is individuals who were missed as kids. And those people who were not diagnosed as kids tended to be older. They were women, employed, and preferred the term autism. So you can see again that lots of girls were missed, and they tended to be more high functioning because they're employed. They're getting through life. They're doing all right. And so they get overlooked. However, those who were diagnosed as children and those who were self-diagnosed both reported similar levels of stigma. So they experienced that stigma throughout their life, regardless of whether or not they had the diagnosis, and then also low self-esteem as well. Now, my concern about self-diagnosis is really that it requires so much more self-advocacy. There's not going to be people who are there to kind of help someone get the services that they need. It's really on the individual to go out and, make sure that they're getting accommodations or whatever it might be at school or work. And in therapy, I would encourage any of you who are providing services for autistic individuals to really just, listen and explore what that diagnosis means to them, hear them, and just you can make it part of the therapy process, just kind of exploring that. So providing support after a diagnosis is huge. We want kids to understand how their brain works. So I will point you all to Dr. Liz Angoff's website. She has fabulous recommendations for like what language to use when you're talking about a diagnosis with kids. And it's just an amazing website. I think I'm out of time. Almost. Okay, but one thing that I definitely wanted to touch on is avoiding the forced neurotypical social skills. So helping parents realize that just because your kid is making eye contact does not necessarily mean that they are listening. So how does this child look when they're listening? Are they fidgeting? Are they looking at something else? How can we create a safe space for them and understand that they don't look like a neurotypical kid whenever they're focused on something, because forcing eye contact can actually induce like a stress response, which makes it harder to concentrate, harder to think clearly. So just again, thinking about the individual child and what they look like. Okay, and then I just included these in here too about possible strengths of autism, and then common challenges, just so that you can kind of look at those, and it can be helpful. I've gone through some of my patients. I've gone through this with some of my patients and talked about those highways in their brain that work really efficiently and those construction zones where they need more support. So I think it's good to kind of look at both of those. So moving forward, especially with diagnosis, what do we need to do? We really first and foremost need to listen to autistic voices. So we need to hear what the experience is like for these individuals, and adjust our testing so that it's more inclusive. So sensory-friendly testing environments we have standardized testing, but can we incorporate some like fidgets or things that help them feel more comfortable? And then just alternative ways of communicating. That's another thing to consider. And the goal is ultimately we want the client to feel understood and empowered by the process and not invalidated. So even if someone doesn't receive a diagnosis, how can we make them feel like this was an empowering process that brought them greater self-understanding? And I love this quote by Dr. Liz Angoff. As a society, we've become more aware of autism, but we are still learning to accept and appreciate autism as an important difference in brain wiring rather than a deficit or disease. And so I hope that we can get to that point to where we have true acceptance and appreciation. And one little tool that I would suggest y'all consider is there is a lot of negative feelings about the use of puzzle pieces for autism, because this idea like I'm not a puzzle to solve or I don't have a missing piece. And so the symbols that are preferred nowadays are generally the infinity symbols. So I have them there. So just something to consider, whenever you are putting together resources for families, that is generally the symbol that's preferred. And I've got some books, lots of recommendations. Books, a lot of these were written by autistic individuals, and I think, again, that's where we're going to get the most valuable information. Oh, okay, did it.
Thank you both very much, Dr. Benners and Dr. Smith, for providing and sharing that valuable information with us today. We are going to take a break and resume at 11:05 with Dr. Wendy Johnson talking about treatment options and takeaways. Thank you. And if you still have not signed in, please do so. Okay, welcome back. And there's information being put into the chat for those that have asked questions. Dr. Wendy L. Johnson is a licensed psychologist and associate professor of school psychology at Texas Women's University for the last 11 years. Dr. Johnson is also the director of the Woodcock Autism Assessment Clinic, which completes multidisciplinary evaluations for children between the ages of 18 months and 18 years for the possibility of an autism spectrum disorder. Dr. Johnson teaches coursework at TWU, such as school neuropsychology assessment, direct behavior intervention, psychology of violence, trauma and abuse, and developmental psychology, as well as coordinates the practicum and internship placements for the program. Dr. Johnson's research team, entitled the BRAIN team, acronym standing for Behavior, Research, Assessment, and Intervention in Neurodevelopment Disorders, has multiple projects ongoing that examine autism intervention and assessment, mothers in academia, teacher and school psychologist burnout, autism and suicidality, and early screening for autism in collaboration with PCPs. Welcome, Dr. Johnson.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm excited to talk with you guys today. I have been listening all morning just because I wanted to make sure I didn't cover something that has already been covered or reiterate something, but I think we're good to go. I feel like this has been a good workshop as far as the transition to where we're at right now. Treatment, takeaways, what do we do now? You guys heard this morning about what is autism spectrum disorder, the different diagnostic criteria, and then symptomatology, as well as differential diagnosis. I think that's a huge piece of this, because obviously if we don't diagnose correctly, then we don't know how to intervene, right? We've got to start there with the diagnostic side. And so today, my course kind of talking about so we figured out what is autism, how do we assess it, and now we're kind of at, okay, what do we do about it? I run the autism clinic here in town on Thursdays, one day a week, and we have graduate students from speech OT as well as psychology. And so,
oh, Dr. Johnson, you froze.
right? What are some of those tools that we can do that we can use to help our child, whether they have a diagnosis or not. There's obviously an area of concern or referral question. And so we need to address that. And what do we do about it? So I kind of broke down the presentation today in 3 different areas. So really starting with looking at like, what is that knowledge, right? We all come from different backgrounds. I enjoy seeing like where everybody is from and the different training and degrees and background that you guys bring to this talk today. And so looking at that, okay, what knowledge do we have? What do we have as a field? What do I have personally as far as my training? What are the research out there? So really that broad-based understanding. And you're here today. So that means that you want to learn, you want to grow in this area. And then we kind of go down to what is that specific, that relationship? How do we integrate some of these tools that we're talking about so that we know how to intervene in the best way? How do we build that greater understanding of behavior? So often people come to us as psychologists for assessment because something's happening. There's questions, right? We got to figure that out. So trying to understand the behavior. And then that lowest point of our delving into building that relationship, knowing, understanding the needs, and then figuring out how to intervene and how to treat that or support the family. So that step 1 is really that broad-based understanding, knowing what's out there, what are the treatments available, a few of your previous speakers talked about some of the debate within the field within the autism, and I'm going to touch on that too a little bit because there's a lot out there, depending on who you follow on social media or whatever it is, there's a lot of strong opinions. And so I just wanted to preface this talk with, I'm going to just present the data, present the 2 sides, not trying to, say one way or the other, but just show what's out there. Because I think we as practitioners need to understand, because your clients that are coming to you may come from this perspective or may come from this perspective, and we need to be able to communicate on both levels as far as some of the sensitive areas in the field right now of autism intervention and treatment. I also think it's important to differentiate, we have evidence-based practice, we have, empirically supported treatments, and then we also just have supports and resources for families. And I think it's important as practitioners to understand those differences. Starting first with some of those evidence-based practice. So, we have the National Clearinghouse on Autism Evidence and Practice, and this is a really great resource. Kind of start with those broad-based understanding that we're touching on first here. So this really looks at those practice-based research, it's analyzed, the data's there, and so it really shows that potential impact in the field as far as the research.
Dr. Johnson, I'm sorry to interrupt. Some people are having trouble hearing you, are cutting in and out, and they're asking if you can speak a little bit louder and a little bit slower.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm sorry. No problem. I'm sorry. I can talk louder. I have my speakers turned all the way up, but I will talk louder. So basically I wanted to show this National Clearinghouse on Autism Evidence and Practice, because this is a great resource, especially if you're working with a new family, or maybe this is a field that you're not as familiar with as far as autism intervention. And so you want to really look at, okay, what does the research say, right? That's a great place to start. You can download right here the evidence-based practice report. It is long, 143 pages, but I just wanted to highlight a few sections here on page, I believe it's 28, 29. You can scroll through here and you can see all of the resources that are available, but it basically really breaks down, what does the research tell us? What does the literature and the field tell us as far as which avenues are the most supported as far as evidence-based intervention? So I think that's a great resource for you to start with. I added in some here as far as, so this is just a screenshot of what I just referenced, and the link is in there, it's live. And so you can kind of see, so this is just some of the evidence-based practice for autism. You can kind of scroll through there. Some of these you might be familiar with, some of them you might not be. I like that it gives a definition, a brief overview of what each one is, and then the empirical support that's out there. And so, what are the range of studies, and then how many in each category? So, antecedent-based interventions, things that happen right before the behavior, what can change there environmentally, various communication devices or models there, cognitive behavioral strategies, how are we teaching kids on the spectrum differently, differential reinforcement, reinforcing one area, putting another area on extinction. Discrete child training has a lot of debate, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Functional communication, video modeling, where they're actually seeing various behaviors that you want to encourage or positively impact, prompting, reinforcing. So these are all just examples of some of the evidence-based practice that is out there as far as the research and the literature foundation. Here's some more. So naturalistic interventions, so basically changing the environment to elicit preferred behaviors. A lot of peer-based, there's a lot of literature out there as far as peer-based intervention, especially in the schools if you're working in an educational setting. Reinforcement, prompting, social skills training, obviously very popular out there. Various technologies, as our technology continues to evolve, there's a lot of potential supports out there. Self-modeling, video self-modeling. I did about 5 or 6 years of research in BSM. So there's a lot of strong research out there where they're actually seeing themselves do the behavior, you know, and then you're editing out the supports. And so then the short little movie that they see is like a 2-minute video of them doing the behaviors that you want them to see. And so therefore, you know, they're then able to model it. So there's a lot of efficacious research in regards to video self-modeling. And then I also like that it shows, you know, they have very specific standards, like there has to be a certain number of research articles, a certain number of efficacy shown. But then there's a lot of intervention strategies out there where there maybe doesn't meet that highest standard, but there's still some research that supports it. And so these are some of those where there's some evidence as far as evidence-based practice. So animal-assisted interventions, I don't know if any of you guys have done, you know, various horse therapies, dog therapies, there's several out there. Exposure, you know, like a graduated exposure to an item that potentially causes anxiety. Outdoor adventure type models, outside. So basically summarizing to where we're at right now, looking at the research, finding what's out there, what is appropriate, understanding those, and so then you can better meet the needs of your clients that you're working with. So I wanted to touch on ABA therapy. This is one of those areas I referenced earlier where there's a lot of debate in the field as far as is this an efficacious treatment or not? Insurance, unfortunately, is a big factor within this when we're talking about ABA because currently, because there is a strong research base for it, insurance will, you know, pay for it, help cover those expenses. And so therefore you see ABA centers popping up. We have a ton all over the DFW area. So being able to, I think, again, understand it as a practitioner, understand the pros and cons, I think is important. So basically a background of ABA is that there's principles of the behavior therapy. So that positive reinforcement, you're reinforcing those desired skills, trying to build a foundation on what skills the child already has, and trying to reduce, at the same time, reduce the problematic behavior or self-injurious behavior. So that's the overarching goal. It was originally designed in the 1960s by Lovas, more of a discrete trial training, very strict, you know, do this, say this, you know, repeated trials over and over and over again, lots of repetition. There has been some evolving, you know, over the years since this was originally implemented. So there have been some changes, but that's the basis, the history of it. So like I said, there's pros and cons. People will feel very strongly on one side or the other in regards to this debate. So I just kind of listed some of what the proponents say and what some of the opponents say in regards to ABA. So it's not as much that discrete trial training, while that is a foundation and there is like repetition as far as learning, it's not as strict or adherent to that discrete trial as it was when it was originally developed. It's a lot more play-based, obviously, depending on the child, and use of more than just naturalistic settings, you know, going to the park, you know, and utilizing some of those real world, train some of those social skills or behavior, positive behaviors that you're hoping to encourage. And they say we're not taking away the neurodiversity component because that's one of the negatives at the other side says. And so actually we're developing independence, you know, and seeking some of those individualized goals for those children. On the other side, the opponents of ABA therapy really say it's too scripted. You know, it's too strict. You're not letting the child show their independence or show their uniqueness, and too repetitive, too long. So too many expectations for the child within, a certain paradigm, focuses too much on limiting the negative behaviors rather than really building those skills. And so really trying to focus on maybe what it's not doing, it's not training those skills. So that's the other side of ABA. Some of the other things, so originally, like I said, that was very much discrete trial training, very distinct. Now it's more, instead of trying to get the child to fit within a certain parameter, it's very much more individualized, where they're really looking at individualized goals. Where does this child and really focusing on those language communication skills. So again, on the other side, the opponents, they talk about, they're forcing the child to make eye contact. That's a cultural expectation in some societies. It's not in others. And so we need to take that into consideration. It's trying to stop, various stimming behaviors, lapping, rock, popular, and so by stopping those behaviors or trying to extinguish those stimming behaviors, what are we communicating to the child? Are we communicating that movement or those acts are wrong, because we're trying to stop that stimming behavior rather than seeing that behavior as something that's potentially, an adaptive response in supporting the child. And so those are kind of gives you that perspective on what the two sides of this argument are in regards to ABA treatment for kids with autism. I'm not going to spend much time on this because our first speakers of the day did talk about the language used with autism, identity first, person centered, are all very important. So I do encourage you, if that's something you haven't delved into too much, really look into that. It is important to know. And, the most important thing is to talk to the individual. If they're verbal, if they're able to tell you what they prefer, or the family, what that looks like. Because again, this is one of those areas where people feel strongly on either side. And so, but we have seen a shift from, originally, when I was trained, it was always, person first, a child with autism, and now we're seeing the shift as we're hearing more of the autistic voices to more of that identity first. And so you really need to talk to the family and really get to know the child and family and what their preferences are. So that's the first step. That's that broad overview of what does the research say, what's out there, what's available. You guys as practitioners need to have that foundational knowledge. And then this next step is really building that relationship. You've got to understand the behavior before we seek to intervene and change the behavior or support the family in specific ways. We have to then start with building that relationship as that foundation. So looking at the behavior, observing it, understanding it, before we can change anything, we have to really understand it. So that last question there, should we encourage a child to change his or her behavior before we understand the functionality for the child? All behavior is a form of communication. I'm in my classes. Students are telling us something, whether they're verbally telling us or whether they're doing it through the behavior. What is that behavior telling us? What do we, as the people around that child, need to understand what that behavior is telling us to do or to say or to act or respond? So we have to get to know the child. We have to get to know the system around the child, the teachers, the other practitioners, the family, the extended family. All of that is crucial information to know. Previous speakers talked about the assessment process and how crucial that is. We have to get an accurate diagnosis. We have to have up-to-date data to know then how to move through this next step of intervention. So really spending time with a child, especially like the previous speakers talked about, sometimes you'll have a child walk in, you'll be like, they look like they're on the spectrum, that first impression. But then as you spend time with the child, especially these higher functioning individuals who have learned how to mask, or they know the rules of social engagement, they know what they need to do, right? And so they do it, but it doesn't come naturally. They have to think about it, things that we just do naturally and can read a situation may not come as naturally. And so they actually have to, think, oh, wait, here I'm supposed to do this, and then I do this. And, and so it's so much cognitive effort. But what you see, the behavioral output, doesn't look much like that individual's on the spectrum. But what we don't see is all of that mental effort that's going into that behavior. So that's where you've got to get below the surface of just the topography of the behavior, what you're seeing on the outside. You've got to go below that. You've got to go more in depth, building those relationships, trying to understand the behavior. The second thing is you've got to try to understand the function. Now, this is not a black and white, like, oh, the function is escape. 100% it's going to always be escape. I wish behavior was that clear, but it's not. It's very much a gray area. And so we have to do our best with the data that's provided, with our understanding of the family, of the child, of the social supports, to have our best hypothesis, our best guess. Okay, this behavior is taking place to the best of our knowledge because of escape, avoidance, whatever it is, sensory. So trying to answer that question as to the why, to the best of our abilities. Why is this behavior? What is the child communicating through this behavior? Because that is so crucial, because if we don't have the why, if we don't have our best guess as far as the function of the behavior, we can't intervene appropriately. You could design an amazing intervention for this child, but if it doesn't meet the need as to why the behavior is happening in the first place, then it's not going to work and your intervention is going to be ineffective. And so we have to start with that why. We have to try to understand, to the best of our knowledge, best of our abilities, with the data that we have, why this behavior is taking place, what is being communicated, what is the function of that behavior for that child, that therefore we can best support the family. You have to ask, is this a skill deficit? And like the child doesn't have the skill, because therefore then we need to teach the skill, right? Or is it a performance deficit where they have the skill, but they're not displaying it? So these are the kids who, will do amazing things maybe in the home setting, but the teacher sees a very different child at school or whatever it is, where there's different environmental contingencies that is not allowing the child to display the behaviors. And therefore, it looks like the child may be functioning lower than what they are in a certain setting, even though in a different setting, the child's able to do that skill. And so that would be a performance deficit. And so you have to ask yourself, is it performance deficit? Is it skill deficit? Because again, that informs your intervention and what are you going to do about it? So identifying the need of the behavior, trying to figure out the function of it, and then trying to design that individualized intervention or treatment plan to best meet those underlying needs. So what is it communicating to us? If the child is a speaking child, a verbal child, you can talk to them, you can try to ask them. Sometimes there's a disconnect between, what my body is feeling or doing and then what they're able to say as far as explaining it or talking about it. So again, this goes back to knowing your child, knowing the skill level. But in certain situations, you could prompt such as, my body is telling me my tummy is making noises, so therefore I feel hungry. So trying to connect the body experience with what they can say about it, or identifying it with a certain feeling. So therefore, again, that's helping to build that autonomy, in that the individual can communicate needs. Potentially it's coming out as behavior. They're hungry. And so, they're tantruming or falling on the floor. But really, if they're able to communicate, why is my tummy making these noises? Oh, I need to eat. So somehow being able to communicate that in the way that they're able to help with that autonomy and meet those needs. So therefore, the behavior may not be necessary, or you're able to change the way the behavior is manifested to get those needs met. Our kids that are constantly moving and up and down, it looks like you want to move, looks like your body is telling you something right now, and trying to, again, prompt into understanding what the child may be feeling to see if they're able to communicate that or meet those needs in another way. So we've talked earlier, the speakers talked about the neurodiversity paradigm, and this melds well into what I'm talking about as far as the behavior component, because again, we're building that relationship, we're understanding the child, we're understanding some of these sensory overreactivity. So many of our children on the spectrum do have, those sensory components that are significantly impacting their function. So be it the tags in the clothing or certain foods or the noise level or the temperature, something is different. It's off. It may be different than what we would expect for a child of that age. A lot of kids on the spectrum do have some of that sensory over responsivity. And so, something that a basic noise or, road noise outside, we may be able to tune out, but for that child, they're not able to do that. And so that's creating a significant impact on their ability to function. So it is crucial that we understand that sensory responsivity piece and how those individual differences might be influenced by those observable behaviors. Again, this goes back to, we got to look below the surface. You can't just describe the behavior that we're seeing in the output. We've got to go deeper than that. I always like the iceberg analogy, right? We often just see the iceberg at the top of the water. We don't see how far it goes beneath the ocean, right? And so we've got to look below the ocean. We've got to see what is causing this behavior, this sensory over responsiveness. What can we do to try to understand the observable behaviors that we're seeing to then best support the child? So respecting the behavior, trying to understand those sensory response systems, stress, the stress load on the child, trying to look at those external supports. Are there other stressors that are potentially causing this behavioral reactivity? Emotional regulation. A lot of our kids have a very small, stress window where it may take hypothetically, 5 things before this child explodes. Some of our kids on the spectrum, it may just take one thing before, they lost it. So you've got to figure out what is that threshold as far as emotional regulation. What is expected? What is the expected behavior? We expect a 3rd grader to be able to sit in their chair at school and listen all day with only one 15-minute recess, right? So that's the expectation for an 8-year-old. But what about our child on the spectrum? Are they going to be able to meet that expected behavioral demand in the educational setting? So often, we as a society, we as a school, or whatever setting it is, we have these expectations, and then therefore we reward the kids who are able to sit, all day with just one recess break, and so those kids who then don't meet those expectations, and what messages are they hearing, right? They're hearing, I'm not good enough. I can't do this. I'm not measuring up, right? And so a lot of that negative messaging, because their bodies and their brains are working in a different way and they need different supports in their surroundings. So often our society, we do react to this behavior because it's disruptive to the classroom work. So we have all these point systems and reward charts and, stay on green all day and you get to go, to get ice cream at the end of the week or whatever it is, right? We have all of these systems in place, but often it doesn't account for some of these neurodiversity paradigms. So we really need to understand what that looks like. We need to pause and listen. We need to teach instead of disciplining when they're not doing something. We need to pause and potentially teach that skill or what is expected for that setting. So, with the stemming behaviors, looking away, certain routines, certain kids have to do things the same way every single time. And obviously the real world doesn't always work that way. And so if there's not that routine, or if that routine is interrupted, we may then see a behavioral outburst because that routine has been impacted. Another interesting, if you want to do a little extra research, I'm not covering it in this lecture because it's kind of outside the purview, but the polyvagal theory is an experimental theory in practice, but it's got a lot of research support. Dr. Stephen Porges, but it's basically using, our bodies to help calm some of those nervous systems. So many of our kids are essentially on overdrive, right? They're overly stimulated. That behavioral output that we're seeing is because there's just so much sensory intake coming in and they're not able to filter out some of those. And so, polyvagal theory talks about how can we calm that nervous system, and sometimes the stimming behaviors that we're seeing, the flapping or the rocking, those are calming, and so being able to do that. We do that. Even, neurotypical individuals, often where, move your hands over and over, or you have your leg moving up and down under the table, right? We do these repetitive behaviors, humming, singing, all of those would fall under that criteria of those repetitive behaviors that help calm the system down. And so I think that's an important theory if you want to learn a little bit more about that. So when you're in a moment, right, the child is melting down, there's tantrum, things are happening, you're not sure what to do. I think the most important thing to kind of remember in those moments is that, you as the practitioner are the most important therapeutic tool. Or if there's parents, I know there's some parents sometimes that attend these as well, trying to figure out what can I do as the support person to this individual to help calm this system around the child. So providing those cues of safety, you have to start with that foundation of safety. If they're able to sit close, depending on the child, some, this might overstimulate them, some it's okay, like a hand on the shoulder, being able to potentially use pictures or, distract to a preferred item and then go back to be able to talk about the behaviors. So again, it goes back to knowing the child, what is going to help them when they're in that state of significant emotional dysregulation. What can I do as the therapeutic tool to help calm that situation and bring them back down? So we are shifting our lens from looking at behaviors as, bad or negative, or, and looking at it more as this is part of the underlying need that's being met, and we're seeing it through the behavior that's being manifested. And so really trying to change that disciplinary framework and really looking at it more from a therapeutic framework of trying to understand the behavior and then develop appropriate interventions rather than, kicking them out of school or whatever it is from a disciplinary standpoint. So trying to appreciate the behavior for what need it might be needing. And if there is a way that we can still meet that need, but potentially adapt the behavioral output to something that is able to meet within the setting. Now, again, that's that balance of trying to appreciate the behavior and the neurodiversity of the brain, but do it in a way that allows the child that independence to be able to function, in a certain setting. We've got to always consciously combat that negativity bias, really through awareness, understanding, talking about neurodiversity, trying to understand behavior. I mean, you see a child tantruming in the Walmart, parking lot or whatever, we all make assumptions about, oh, what did the parent do or what's happening, and just really trying to look at some of those biases that we all bring. All too often, I've talked to lots of parents who feel that, here's my child, some days are great, other days it's pretty rough, and so those negative biases that are then put on the parent, feeling like they've done something wrong or they're not doing the right thing or they're not disciplining enough or spanking the child enough or, whatever it is, and really looking at those behaviors, not as much as a, us versus them mentality, or you've done something wrong that this child, is then reacting to, but really looking at those behaviors from a therapeutic mindset of how can we support the child? What is this behavior communicating? Is there a way we can modify that output to still meet that need? So hearing those messages, really looking at that negative cycle. So all too often, the child, engages in a behavior, which then they're either disciplined for or whatever. And so which then increases that stress level, right? So then is the behavior more likely or less likely to happen again? Well, it's more likely. So we are thinking we're helping the behavior by, reprimanding or disciplining or whatever, but because we're increasing that stress level, we're actually increasing the likelihood that the behavior is going to happen again. And so then we kind of get stuck in this negative cycle of negative behaviors. So, all right, so what do we do about it, right? What is how do we develop that individualized plan to support the child and the family? I added in here, and the previous speakers had some great books as well. So there's a lot of links. You guys will have access to this presentation, but practical links, some for younger kids and then some for adolescents, things that are really helpful. And these are even helpful for kids not on the spectrum. Like oftentimes I feel like we also need to support the siblings, right? We need to support the classmates who might have a student in their class, obviously with client permission, but there's ways that we can increase that awareness and that understanding by using some of these tools that are, fun, or reading books, or there's the Sesame Street videos of Julia, like those are ways that young kids can then understand some of this neurodiversity paradigm and do it in a fun way. There's lots of books. I put links on here. Lots of great books that you guys can read to families or provide to families and really be able to help them understand, what autism looks like and how those supports might be in place. There are a lot of groups. This is a link. Dr. Benner's referenced it earlier as far as this is an online link here where you can see there's parent support groups, parent trainings. Here at the bottom, you can see there's books, workshops. So tons of great resources here. This book, Beyond Behaviors, I referenced earlier in this presentation, and I linked it. Mona Delahook's book, I really like her stuff, intervention. So there's lots of resources here. And like I said, you have this link in the presentation, so you can easily access that. So I'd encourage you to use a lot of books or videos when trying to support families. So there's also a lot of great resources in our area, as well as nationwide resources for the Autism Society of America, the Families for Effective Autism Treatment. That's in North Texas one, so that's local. There's autism response teams. It's part of Autism Speaks. So specifically in regards to behavior resources, supports for families, it's really important there. There's information toolkit that's available to families through Autism Speaks. I like a lot of these because these are specific to how much age group you guys work with. Obviously, you would have to tailor your resources or intervention ideas for that age. But there's a couple TED Talks. I just added one in here for young women with autism. As your previous speaker talked about, we have seen an uptick as far as like adolescents self-referring for autism diagnoses. I did half of my clinic cases this spring have been adolescents, which is highly unusual. Usually it's 2 to 3, 4-year-olds instead of 15 and 16, 17-year-olds. So we've definitely seen a trend here. On the positive side, people are self-advocating, they're understanding their brains better. We're taking some of those online assessments that Dr. Benner's referenced earlier, which are positive, that's good things. On the flip side of that, sometimes it's harder then to differentiate as a psychologist to then differentiate how much do they know, how much have they learned. They can cite the diagnostic criteria now. And so just figuring that out and really parsing out what that looks like. But I love some of these resources for adolescents because like the TED Talks and some of these books are really good, especially for those high functioning, I'm going to say female, because that's what we see the most right now, are a lot of these really high functioning females who are being diagnosed later because they've been able to camouflage and mask all those years, and they don't look as autistic during those earlier years that we might see it being manifested. So there's also some good ones on here. I also listed a few for like college readiness, because I think that's another huge piece that we as a field really need to step up on. So we have these kids who either are being diagnosed later, or even if they're diagnosed younger. Here we're getting ready to launch into college and independence and young adulthood, and you got to hold down a job, and you've got to pay for insurance, and you've got to go to young adult may be expected in our society to do, but yet they may not have the executive functioning skills, or there may be some gaps there. And so trying to figure out what that looks like and what supports that need to be in place, and then how to self-advocate if mom and dad are not around anymore. What does that look like? And so I think some of these books, like the Freshman Survival Guide for College Students with Autism, and so just things like that can really help families, I think, through that next step, as they're trying to launch a young adult. So I have some time for questions. If there's anything you guys would like to talk about.
Well, thank you, Dr. Johnson. We do have a couple of comments and questions in the chat. Let me read those to you quickly, or maybe not so quickly, if I can find them.
Stop sharing. So I can see.
So one of the comments was, autistic community is not fond of ABA, feels more that people need to be fixed
Yep.
versus supported.
Yes, that's
Okay.
true. Right. I tried to, hopefully I represented that, but yes, there is. It's the high functioning, very verbal autistic community. Absolutely. You know, there's a lot of debate on that. Like I said, for so long, that was like the treatment, you know, 60s, 70s, 80s. And now that we're hearing more autistic voices, we're not, we're hearing a different perspective on that for sure. Definitely.
Okay. And then one of the questions is, what are your opinions on ABA for a child that is autistic and also DMDD?
So my first thing that comes to mind when you ask that question is when you see a child with autism, you see a child with autism, right? Every child is so individual and so unique that I think I wouldn't even say I would recommend that without knowing the child and knowing all the background, knowing all the history. Can it be potentially appropriate for some kids? It can be, but can it also be not appropriate for other kids? Absolutely. And so I think that really goes back to what we were talking about as far as having that individual knowledge of the child. What support should they have? What does the data tell us before we can recommend any intervention, ABA or otherwise?
And then I know Jenny Stonemeyer did answer or talk to Jolette. I hope I'm saying it right. Special needs teacher here. I have 15 kids and most are nonverbal. I almost solely go on their behavior for communication. The TEACCH system works quite well for them.
Yes, I actually do like the TEACH system. I didn't talk about it today. I trained in North Carolina, so those are my roots many years ago. So I actually really like the TEACH system. It's a lot of visual supports, especially if you have non-speaking children. Using those visual supports, using the charts, we can respond by pointing to something. I think it is a strong system, especially in a classroom setting where you can have those supports and the child then is able to potentially communicate, even if they're not using words, but they're able to communicate through pictures and other ways within the classroom setting.
And then there's folks asking for the access to the list, I guess, that you referenced, and they're wanting the slideshow. I guess Brittany says the links are not in the download. Okay. So
I can email it to somebody, or I mean the links are in my original. I'm not sure how that works when I sent it to, like I embedded the links into the talk.
We'll see if we can work on that. The complete slideshow is in the workshop handout packet that's on watchdenton.org, and I can link the website here again as well. But all of her slides should be within the.
And if you're able to scroll up a little bit into the chat, Mandy has put that in there previously. I look at the time; it was 11:04 when she put it in. So if you can scroll up to find it, but she is probably able and willing to put it back in the chat. Any other questions, comments for Dr. Johnson? We're finishing a little early.
I'll put the link in the chat here too. So. All right, so this is just the general website link there. And if you click through that, there's a section that says visuals and videos. There's a section that says books, and there's a lot of great tools here.
That's great.
The original, it's in there, but that website that's on there, you can just click through. There's a couple different tabs in there that will give you some also additional resources.
Okay, thank you. And Mandy did put the handout link in the chat just now, so those that are interested in opening that up to have it as a reference, please do so. We are finishing a little bit early, so we do appreciate you, Dr. Johnson, for giving us that valuable information. We are going to take a break, but it's going to be a little bit longer this time. So we will come back at 12:10 for Jenny Stonemeyer, and she'll talk about social support and accessibility. Thank you, guys. Welcome back, everybody. Just one more reminder, in the chat is the sign-in link. If you have not already done so, please do sign in. We want to thank Dr. Wendy Johnson again for her great presentation. And now Jenny Stonemeyer has spent her career working alongside and on behalf of people with disabilities, their families, and communities. After 12 years as a music therapist and increasing frustrations with systematic barriers to inclusion that her clients faced, she received a master's degree in child and family law from Loyola University, Chicago School of Law, and found her professional home in the advocacy world. Jenny has worked as a private advocate for families, a project director at the Wisconsin Parent Training and Information Center, director of education policy for a national training and technical assistance center, and executive director for a national organization supporting employment for people with disabilities. In 2022, she accepted the role as executive director with REACH, Inc., the independent living center serving Dallas, Tarrant, Denton, and Collin counties. Thank you for sharing your wisdom today, Jenny.
Thanks so much for the invitation. I really appreciate it. It's been a really resource-rich morning. I think I've been most heartened to hear the similarities between what all of the speakers have presented and shared with us. So I think what I'm going to share is not much different, except that my perspective is different. So let me tell you a little bit about who REACH is as an organization and how we can support you in your work. My bio makes it sound like I don't know anything about Texas. I grew up here. I am a product of Texas public education. I graduated from school in Plano. I was raised by Midwesterners and went off to college in Iowa and got distracted for 30 years and came back to Texas in the middle of COVID, which was an interesting time to move across country. But I'm really grateful to be back. I never saw myself coming back to Texas, but it feels more like home than it ever did growing up here. Centers for Independent Living are based in what's called the independent living movement. And the independent living movement was founded by a group of individuals with disabilities in the early 70s who had been accepted to college and were trying to find work and were facing some of the systemic barriers that continue to persist in our society that prevented them from participating in the regular adult life. So Centers for Independent Living were written into federal legislation, which is that top bullet point, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And are now continue up to be a part of that legislation. We are a congressionally mandated resource for individuals with disabilities so that they can seek out living independent and self-directed lives. That is our beginning of the day, end of the day, everything that we do in between. But disability rights and the independent living movement has a long and really rich history in the US and internationally as well. And so I wanted to kind of contextualize the work that we do at independent living centers within the civil rights movement, because that's disability rights are civil rights, are human rights, right? These are all part of the same continuum. So just to put the context of the movement that we're in and the struggle that we're in, we take very much a social justice perspective to disability rights and our advocacy efforts. And we support people to achieve whatever goals they're looking for. So the three little bullets on the second column, we do not have disability criteria. We're not serving a specific population of individuals with disabilities. We don't have income eligibility requirements. We don't have age requirements. Somebody comes to our organization, and it might be another service provider who comes to our organization looking for support. We are going to do our very best. We have physical spaces in Dallas, Tarrant, Denton, and Collin counties, but the counties that are adjacent to the Metroplex are not served by another Center for Independent Living. So we will support anybody who's in those adjacent counties as well. All of our services are free. We are a federally grant-funded and state grant-funded nonprofit organization. So if we can be of any support to you in your work, please don't hesitate to reach out. If you do not live in the DFW area, there are centers for independent living serving all large metro areas and should be covered in every state. So you can do a simple Google search to find the resource that would support where you are, but we're not, find the resource that works for you as well. The other perspective that I bring to this work is this young man who is my son. He's 22. I started my career working with individuals with disabilities, but and found the world of advocacy, but that became kind of very much changed, and my perspective became very changed when my son was identified as being on the autism spectrum. That's the language that I use. I don't use the word diagnosed. He was identified as being on the autism spectrum as he was entering second grade. If I think about his development, he was my first child. If I think about his development, I started to notice developmental differences when he was about 8 or 9 months old. His pediatrician patted me on the head and said that I was being a nervous first-time mom when I raised concerns with him. And that kind of began our perspective of and our relationship of supporting him. He met all of his developmental milestones barely, always within the outside window. And he graduated from high school, participated in general education, graduated with a regular diploma, and needed supports of special education starting in second grade. So I will talk a little bit later about sort of the tension between person-centered supports and the language of diagnostics, because there is some definite tension in those. But when we were getting him evaluated at public school for special ed services, I was explaining it to my mother, and my mom said, "Why do we have to pathologize this?" And I said, "Well, because it's the only way to get him services and supports, and that's really what he needs to be successful." So I recognize the tension between the two models, but have to acknowledge it as well. So I became a mom of this young man. He's 22 now. If I said that already, forgive me. He's living at home. He is accessing vocational rehabilitation services. So I'll talk a little bit about that. He's not the only autistic individual that I've supported in my career, but he's the one that I continue to support and stand by every day. So he is my bias in this work. But I did this work before he came into the world and became a part of this context for me. So what I hope for the next hour and a bit is that we're going to talk about accessibility in 3 dimensions, and I'll explain what I mean by that. We're going to talk about a person-centered approach to accessibility, as well as the changing needs of accessibility for over not only the age and the time span, but development and stages of development. And none of this is linear, as you might expect. We're going to discuss treatment and some of that inherent tension in treatment, and identify opportunities for advocacy. And then I've got a list of resources that I'm actually really glad are different from the resources that some of the other individuals have shared, that really complementary, because I have tried to identify resources that are much less clinical and much more on the representational side of autism, and seeing autistic individuals in the media and kind of understanding where we are in the world. And then my last hope for this time is that you guys get whatever you need. So if we have time for questions, I will absolutely, I just realized that I can't see the chat, so.
Do you want me to interrupt you with questions as they go, or do you want to do it at the end? We'll have time at the end.
However, if you need to interrupt me, please do. Don't be shy about that.
Okay.
But then we can review them at the end. I think that would be ideal. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
So I think most people think of accessibility as the physical aspects of accessibility, curb cuts and door openers and braille and visual cues. Levered handles are aspects of disability, are aspects of the physical forms of accessibility. But accessibility is more than that. It's also about language. It's about using plain language. It's about using concrete terms. It's about limiting colloquialisms, especially when you're supporting autistic individuals or in a community with autistic individuals. Limiting metaphors or being very concrete in those metaphors, and the way we use language in terms of giving instructions. So I always use the example of, if you think about a task that you're going to ask someone to complete, and you're not thinking about neurodiversity or neurodivergent thinking, you might say, I want you to clean the bathroom. And that's the end, right? It's not the beginning. And when you're chaining instructions, you can say, I want you to clean the bathroom. First, I want you to do this. Second, first, I want you to pick up all the trash. Second, I want you to do the next step. You're going to do the first step, you're going to do the second step, and then you're going to do the third step and build it together so that you're scaffolding. This kind of chaining of instructions can help people who have processing challenges. It'll give them several opportunities to interact with the information that you're sharing. It'll also give them reiteration of the task so that they're able to remember it. They're able to put it into different constructs and scaffolds that they have. If they have previous experience doing something, they might be able to connect it. And so we're talking about using the scaffolding and the chaining of instructions to make language accessible in these things. And then then you might want to have a visual support as well of written instructions that they could reference independently if they needed it, so they didn't need to come back to you. So language is one thing, and I add a third bullet of communication. I think language is an aspect of communication, but communication is so much more than just language. A lot of the previous presenters have talked about verbal and nonverbal communication, and I'm so happy to hear people talking about behavior as communication, because that has been sort of the mantra for many, many, many years of mine, is that all behavior is communication, good, bad, or ugly. So communication can be verbal, it can be nonverbal, but communication can also be the expectations of what an autistic individual needs to do. And then I said the responses to what. When I'm going to use my son as an example in many of these anecdotes with you, and I say this very purposefully, that whenever I use my son as a reference, he knows that I'm talking about this. I ask him permission every single time I'm planning on giving a presentation or talking about him publicly. I have his permission and his consent. I think it's really important that we support the individuals to have autonomy over their own story and control of their own story. So just as an aside, that he's a part of this conversation as well and knows about it. When he says what to me, if I ask him a question or give him an instruction, he says what as a question. I pause and say, do you need me to repeat myself? Meaning say the same thing with exactly the same words. Or do you need me to say it differently? So responding to the what means making my communication accessible, asking him to take a moment to consider what he needs. Maybe he needs a little bit more time to process whatever it was that I said. Maybe he needs time to shift gears from what's going on in his head to what's happening out in, we call it the three-dimensional world, what's happening out in with others. He needs to shift gears so that he can be present and attending to what's happening in front of him. So responding to that what is giving him an opportunity to assess what he needs, ask for what he needs, and then giving me a chance to say it again, say the thing again in exactly the same words, or explain it a different way, or just pause the conversation so that he has another opportunity to engage in it because he wasn't quite ready to engage. The foundation of accessibility in 3 dimensions is the presumption of competence, the presumption that whoever it is that I'm interacting with has the competence to be a part of whatever we're doing, a conversation or an activity or an instruction. I always think it's so incredibly important to think from a perspective of, I believe that you can do this. I know that you can do this. We're just going to have to figure out how to make it work the best. So presuming competence is probably one of the most important perspectives for successfully supporting disabled individuals, whether they're autistic or have another identification, to be successful and be independent and be self-directed. So other aspects of accessibility, we talked about the physical space, we talked about language and communication and the difference between the two, and sort of this foundational perspective of presuming competence. Other aspects of accessibility are lighting. Fluorescent lights are evil. They're evil for a lot of people. I don't know if you can see my background. I am lucky enough to have an office with big windows. I have a single desk lamp on behind me. I do not have fluorescent lights on. I am not autistic, but I have a long history of migraines, and fluorescent lights are an oscillating light. They're constantly turning off and on. And I had a friend who explained it to me that when we are in fluorescent lights, we are constantly being plunged into darkness, which sounds really dramatic, and yet you think about it, and it is kind of not a pleasant environment to be in. So fluorescent lights aren't the only problem. And not the only sensitivity for accessibility, but lighting is a huge issue for making sure that environments are accessible. Ambient noise is another aspect of it. People, machinery, there's the lawn service that's happening outside my window, and that is always challenging. I have a hearing impairment. I wear hearing aids, and so there's all kinds of challenges with hearing aids that think, oh, now you can hear. Well, no, you can't really hear. You can hear noises that you can't always tell where they're coming from. Smells, sounds, hygiene, and dress are some of the other aspects of accessibility that need to be considered, particularly amongst environments that are supporting autistic individuals. And by the way, all environments are supporting autistic individuals, whether we know that or not, whether they self-identify. We can be accessible. We can make our environments accessible to autistic individuals without them needing to ask. And I think that is really key to kind of that social aspect of building accessibility. So when I say, oh, hold on. I'm sorry. When I talk about smells, highly scented environments are really stimulating and can be overstimulating. We've all had the experience of somebody in the grocery store, you don't even know where they are, but you can smell their cologne. And it's overwhelming and it's unpleasant and it's distracting. And sometimes it can be derailing from you completing whatever it is that you're there to do, right? It's distracting to the point of being detrimental. Now, if we are a neurotypical individual and we have that experience, you can imagine the sort of the amplification of that experience that somebody who has a smell sensitivity, who is neurodiverse, that might be even more amplified, that distraction, that overwhelm, that discomfort. I mean, it can be physically uncomfortable if there is an overwhelming smell. My son particularly has a very, very sensitive gag reflex. That's part of his oral motor sensitivity. It can be triggered by a lot of things. So we keep a no scents in our laundry. Nobody wears perfume. There's no highly scented cleaners in the house. So we try to really limit the kind of olfactory input that he might have. Other environments, our offices are scent free. We have not only chemical sensitivities, but obviously the sensory parts of it as well. So there are no chemicals, smells, nothing, no scents that are in our offices. Sounds, I talked a little bit about sounds in ambient noise, but also the sounds that autistic individuals might make. Whether they are producing that sound or that sound is coming from, my son uses puzzle cubes, Rubik's cubes that come in every permutation from shape-shifting to 12-sided to, I cannot tell you how many puzzle cubes we have in the house. He almost always has one in his hand. They often make noise and they can be distracting. And that distraction is my problem. It's my, when I am distracted by that noise, that's my problem to solve, because that is an accessibility tool that he has and needs to be able to interact in that moment. So tolerating those sounds, not expecting them to be quiet, those kinds of things are other ways to increase the accessibility and opportunity for him to be a part of things. Hygiene and dress are really challenging topics, but they're really important for particularly autistic adults to talk about and to learn about, and for the neurotypical adults to consider and put some context around. Hygiene can be challenging because it's a sensory overload. You can imagine brushing your teeth if you have sensory issues. It's not just what's happening in your mouth, but it's the noises and the vibration and the bone conduction of that stimulation in your mouth that's happening and transferring to your head, to your ears, to your entire body. So brushing your teeth, washing your face, getting a haircut. In the picture, my kid is curly haired, and it gets pretty moppish sometimes because getting a haircut for him is absolutely exhausting. It's overstimulating, it's overwhelming for him. So we don't get haircuts very often. And I let him decide when he wants one. Whenever my husband goes to get a haircut, I say, hey, we're going to get a haircut. Do you want one? Sometimes it's yes, sometimes it's no. He also, excuse me, my phone's ringing. He also doesn't shave very often. He has a full beard. It's another sensory challenge for him. Getting his beard to be trimmed is another conversation as well. So there's that tension between the autistic manifestation for him, his neurodiversity and his experience with this neurodiversity, and sort of the societal expectations of, oh, he looks like he's a mess, or he's not dressed appropriately, or he's not fitting into the social expectations. There can be a little bit of tension. So accessibility, when we talk about this in terms of 3 dimensions, really comes back to what are the expectations and what are those expectations for? I'm seeing the questions. I appreciate the agreement that fluorescent lights are evil. Has exposure therapy helped with reducing some of those sensory reactions? So I think it's a great question. I am letting him be entirely self-directed in therapies. This was a kid who I was the mom who was going to do the early intervention and was going to support him to, I'm not going to say fix it, but address the challenges that he experienced when he was little and younger. So exposure therapies, we did a lot of therapies when he was younger. We worked with the speech language pathologist to get him on a sensory diet. We did do horseback riding therapy. We did all kinds of things. He saw a developmental pediatrician. He's been to cognitive behavioral therapy. This was a kid who we got him evaluated for, we lived in Wisconsin when he was school age, early school age. And Wisconsin has a waiver that you can use Medicaid dollars to pay for ABA therapy. We got him evaluated for the waiver and they told us, congratulations, he's not disabled enough. So he's one of those kids who we probably would have used the title of high functioning, the label of high functioning. But there's all of this is that tension of the diagnostic criteria, again, that you have to meet the threshold, you have to have a score, there's always a cut score. He never quite met them, but the struggle was still there. So has exposure therapy helped? Yes, it has helped in the past, but those sensory reactions are still very much a part of who he is. And at this point in my life and at this point in his life, I'm going to let his ongoing pursuit of addressing those sensory reactions be directed by him. I'm here to support him. I'm here to offer ideas. I was so excited to hear Dr. Benners talking about the pathological demand avoidance. That was a new one for me. And boy, does it seem like that shoe fits some of his experience. So my job is to bring those things to him and offer them to him and let him be self-directed in those choices. But it's a great question. I don't know where we would be right now without some of the interventions that we tried when he was younger. So my next slide says, what is person-centered accessibility? I think you've probably gotten the gist of what it is. Person-centered accessibility is, what does the individual need? Yes, there are things that we can do in environments to make environments more accessible. By the way, when we're making environments more accessible to an autistic individual, they're more accessible to everybody. The fluorescent lights is probably the key example of making environments more accessible, because you walk into a place and if the lighting is harsh, you might have an adverse reaction to it, but not immediately be able to identify, oh, it's the lighting, or oh, it's the smell of the carpet that was newly installed and it has to off gas, which I think is the grossest term. It has to get rid of all of its chemical residue that's in it, and that means we're breathing that in. So when we create environments that are accessible to autistic individuals, it really benefits everyone. So what does person-centered accessibility mean? Let's talk specifically about a workplace. In a workplace, it means helping an employer explain and really clearly articulate the work, what it is that they're expecting of that worker, both from the big picture perspective, but also down to the day-to-day, and then even down into task by task, what's expected. That then becomes an assistance to help the autistic individual understand the job and put that information into a context that they might need. So I know that part of this work is going to be that I'm helping the packaging of the products that are being prepared for shipment and delivery. Today, my job is going to be building boxes and preparing the packaging materials so that the product can be laid in there. So an accessible environment that's focused on the individual, that boss or supervisor or whomever, maybe it's a natural support, maybe it's the colleague who's doing a shift handoff to the person, is going to take the time to say, we're going to build boxes. We start over here, we assemble them here, we take them into this room, we put the packaging materials inside, we put them over here so that product assembly can pick them up and do their job. Your goal for the day is to assemble X number of boxes from start to finish. So there's the very specific task-oriented work and laying out that expectation, but then there's the big picture for the day. What is the expectation? So when we lay out all of this information, the autistic individual has the ability to have predictability. They know what to expect for that day. And we'll talk about self-advocacy in a moment, but they also have the ability to advocate for what they might need. If there are clear expectations, they can communicate what their needs are so that they're better able to succeed in that day. But they can also manage the expectations of their supervisor or their boss or whoever has those expectations. Another example is if an autistic person struggles with executive functioning, how can work expectations be adapted, not changed? And I think that that's really key. We're not modifying in a work environment. There is a whole section of supported employment that is really job modification and job customizations, but I'm talking about an individual working in a job that is just a regular sort of off-the-shelf job. So how can work expectations be adapted to support the autistic individual's skill set? My son struggled with he has had jobs in the past, struggled with the paperwork of requesting time off. He didn't know how to do it. He got fired over it actually once because he didn't request time off and he was scheduled for a shift and he just didn't show up because he had gone to Chicago to visit his family. And that was the natural consequence, right? Like I couldn't do anything about that. And it just happened. There was no amount of advocacy that was going to save that situation. At the end of the day, it turned out he was really, really unhappy in that job in the first place and hadn't talked to me about it and hadn't talked to his boss. So again, self-advocacy is really critical. So when something goes wrong in the workplace, it's the perfect segue. How can we support the employer and the employee, the worker, to problem solve together, to figure out what happened? We had a therapist who called it the social autopsy. After the interaction goes wrong, how can we come back together to say, well, what happened? What did you do? What could you have done? What do you think that other person was saying or expected, or where did it break down and fall apart? That ability to help the autistic individual learn from the circumstance to come to them to say, I understand that this fell apart. I want to help. I want to better understand how I can help you in the future. I also want us to figure out how we can work together, is a paradigm shift for most people, for most autistic individuals who haven't necessarily been engaged in the fixing of the problems and the breakdowns that they've had. So really giving someone an opportunity to learn from a mistake, to make it better, and to learn how to improve it into the future is person-centered accessibility. So we've talked a lot about supporting young people and young autistic children, kids. I wanted to talk about how accessibility changes over the lifetime. This is a study of one. So this is purely the experience of me parenting my child. But I use this to show how his needs both have changed, but also haven't changed as he has gotten older and as he's grown. When he was a boy, when he was a kid, he needed to crash after school. And when I say crash, that's one of those non-concrete terms. He needed to sleep. He needed quiet. He needed sensory input. He needed to be wrapped up. We called it a burrito blanket, would wrap him up really tight in a blanket that all he had to do was extend his arms and he was free. But that was the kind of support that he needed after school. If he didn't get that support, his anxiety and his stress level would manifest in his behavior. He would become really emotionally reactive. And those are things that are consistent now, even as an adult. He needed opportunities for calming sensory input, and this was throughout his day. We needed to provide him with a weighted lap pad so that if he was expected to sit in a classroom, he could have the lap pad on his lap and provide some sensory input. He needed opportunities to move. He needed a seat cushion. He needed a ball, a great big yoga ball. A BOSU, I don't know if folks don't know, a BOSU is it's a ball, but it's a half of a ball, and it's on a really sturdy plastic frame that you can sit on the ground. So they can bounce on the ball, they can jump on the ball, they can roll around on it and get all kinds of sensory input from it. Or a rebounder, which is just a floor, small trampoline kind of thing. He needed something chewy, non-food, sometimes food, but in the classroom, it was typically non-food. He needed something chewy. He needed to get out. There was a lot of energy that was expended when he was able to chew on something. He needed safety to release his emotions, and whatever those emotions were. He needed to be able to cry in environments that were not socially acceptable of boys crying, and societies that are not acceptable of boys or young men crying. And that was something that he needed. He was not crying because he was upset. He was crying because he was overwhelmed, because he was overstimulated, and because that was the release of that energy that he could manage. He needed other ways to express his knowledge. If he was asked a question, he would freeze and would look at you. He has a look on his face which looks like guilt, but it's very much not guilt. It's a fear of getting in trouble. And So he needed to be, when he was overwhelmed or overstimulated, he needed to be able to answer in ways other than using verbal language. He will write things, even now, he will write things to me on his phone and hand me his phone so I can read it, because talking about it or engaging in a conversation around it is too much for him. Super simple, doesn't take any, well, I mean, it does take technology, but it takes technology that we all have. But being able to have that available and supporting him to use that, right? Giving him the advocacy skills so that he can say, I can't talk about this right now, but I want to tell you, and then go through whatever it is and write it out so he could hand that to anybody, is critical. There are also implications for this in terms of law enforcement and police officers. I'm going to talk about that a little bit in the next slide. But if you think about sort of the whole societal and community context, how much these influences of accessibility can really help people, not only to keep them safe, but to ensure that people are truly being understood. There's implications for all of it. When he was little, he needed to be able to develop genuine friendships. Who doesn't, right? Like, we all need to be able to develop genuine friendships. He needed a little bit more support in developing those friendships and needed to have a little bit of facilitation in developing those friendships, because that was not his skill set. But I will tell you that the friends that he had when he was in early grade school, we have moved all over the country since then, and he is still friends with them. Those are true, absolutely meaningful relationships. He also needed supportive adults. And I say these because we all need those things. Like, every single one of us needs those things. But he needed them in his life in different ways. So now he's older, he's 22, he'll be 23 in the fall. He still needs high expectations. He needs to manage his sensory input. He does that a lot with headphones. He does that a lot with music input, so that he is managing and reducing the amount of other auditory input that he's getting. He needs opportunities to advocate. We are still working on that. That is an ongoing challenge. He needs curious, supportive adults who are going to say, hey, dude, how are you? How is it going? What do you need? Can I help you? You know, people who ask questions with an intent of really wanting to know what's going on in his life, as opposed to the polite, socially acceptable, how are you? Oh, I'm good. I'm not, I'm dying inside, right? Like, we all have those days where we give the answer of I'm good because the truth is just sometimes too much. So having curious and supportive adults is something that he needs in his life. Again, genuine friendships. Again, he needs opportunities to crash after social interactions. He goes to a support group and he goes for 2 hours. There's transportation on either side, but he's gone for probably 4 or 5 hours. He gets home, he walks in the house, he waves, he doesn't say anything, he waves, he goes upstairs. And I usually say, he gets home right after dinner, and I usually say, are you hungry? And he says no, and goes upstairs, and he's done for the night. He needs that opportunity to just decompress from the social interaction. He still needs that opportunity to safely release his emotions, and he needs someone to be a partner in developing plans when those plans will affect him, meaning he needs somebody to say, we're going to do this. I'm his mom. Doesn't matter that he's 22. I'm still his mom. He needs other adults in his life besides his mom to do this stuff, right? Like, when most of us were 22, we were not talking with our mom every day, doing things. All right, I am looking at time and want to move us along. I'm going to talk a little bit about this inherent tension between the medical model and a person-centered approach. We've talked a lot about it, but one thing that I haven't heard from the other speakers that I want to raise is the anecdotal and research, research defined exposure to trauma that people with disabilities are so much more likely to experience. The ACEs study, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, is an ongoing survey of childhood experiences that includes all kinds of exposures to potentially trauma-inducing sexual exploitation, physical abuse, verbal abuse, all kinds of experiences. The respondents, and this is a survey that's been happening for generations, the respondents to this survey who are individuals with disabilities overwhelmingly are more likely to have experienced instances of physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, exploitation, these very, very trauma related experiences. So when we talk about supporting individuals with disabilities and making environments more accessible, we need to be talking about a trauma-informed approach to that. And that is simply the presumption that anyone in a room, any one of us on this call today could have and probably have had a trauma in our life. And how do we bring a trauma-informed approach to the work that all of us are doing? I don't know where the research, I am not an academic, I am not a clinician, but I would pose the question to some of those who have been on the call earlier to say, where is the state of research on trauma-informed accessibility for people with disabilities? Because I think that that's kind of that would be, in my mind, sort of the new frontier of how do we build accessible environments. Bringing a trauma-informed approach into it is my way of ensuring that accessibility is built in. It's a bigger conversation than we have in this time, but just to say it out loud. Instances of seclusion and restraint are horrific, and I have supported an alarming number of individuals and been a part of mediations and lawsuits and all kinds of dispute resolution with families whose child, very often autistic child, was secluded or restrained in the classroom. I say this with the utmost respect and acknowledgement of the challenges and lack of resources that educators face every single day in the classroom. So I'm not saying this to say that I'm not placing blame anywhere. I think that's what I want to say the most, is that circumstances happen, and they happen for a number of reasons. And I honestly and truly believe that there is not a single educator who sees seclusion and restraint as a primary tool in their toolbox. But for me, the advocacy issue is how do we support educators and other caregivers to have a more robust toolbox to support the behavioral needs of young autistic people. And I'm going to move along and talk about expectations of compliance and consequences for non-compliance. I think some of the other speakers addressed this really completely and really nicely. So the words that are on the left side of the page are really sort of that treatment kind of perspective, and then the words on the right side of the page are really intended to be more of the person-centered approach. And I'm grateful that other speakers have acknowledged it for us, but understanding neurodiversity, educating communities about neurodiversity, communities and colleagues and others in faith communities and everybody in communities, helping autistic individuals advocate for themselves. I'll talk about that a little bit more. And then providing ongoing and phased supports. I think the thing that I have realized with my son is that I think that we've got something, a skill set established and really ingrained into who he is. And something happens, something changes. So like I check it off my sort of mental list in my head of like, oh yeah, we did that. Nope, not necessarily. We need to go back and revisit or have another conversation or remind. So ongoing and phased supports are really important. Peer supports in education are also incredibly important, especially as autistic adults get older. My son doesn't need his mom to tell him how to do things, to tell him how to organize things, or, set the do not disturb on his phone, or any of those things, but having a peer do that is really different. Mandy, are we okay on time? Yes, thank you. Thumbs up is great. So advocacy. Advocacy comes in all shapes and sizes. That's my son and my daughter. We're in front of the US Capitol. We had a self-advocacy day at the Capitol and got to go on some Hill visits. This was the Take Your Kids to Work Day a couple of years ago when we lived in Maryland and I worked in DC. Advocacy comes in all shapes and sizes. All behaviors is communication. We heard that before. I go the step farther to say all behavior is a form of advocacy. Somebody needs something and they may not have the communication skills or the bandwidth to be able to ask for what they need in a socially acceptable way, but all behavior is advocacy. So effective advocacy is rooted in understanding what an individual's needs are. If my son knows how and what works best for him, he's better able to ask for what he might need. The other thing that really contributes to effective advocacy is reducing the stigmas associated with asking for help. Accessing supports at work and school is not an indication of failure. And so often, both the adults in these systems as well as the peers view those supports as a failure, a sense of failure. There's a question in the chat about bandwidth. Thank you for asking. That's one of those words that can mean a lot of things. Bandwidth, when I say someone may not have the bandwidth, they don't have the processing space, they don't have the emotional space, or they may not have the communication, they may not have the ability to communicate it because they are so overwhelmed with other things. So that bandwidth is when I'm regulated, when I'm okay, when I'm managing, when I'm not hot, when I feel comfortable, when I'm well hydrated, I have all of my needs met within my body and my brain to be able to handle the challenges that come along. But when some of those needs aren't met, I can't handle those challenges. And I'm using the phrase, I don't have the bandwidth, like the term spoons for chronic illness. I'm not sure what you mean, Daniel, but I'll have to look that up to better understand. But if that works for you, that's good. I'm glad we found it. So back to the advocacy. Great, perfect. The stigma of asking for help is not an indication of failure. Many of us ask for help and we don't presume, oh, you need help because you can't do it, or, oh, you need help because you have too much to do today and you didn't manage your time well, or you need help because your executive functioning skills are not what they need to be today. If I go to a colleague and say, hey, could you help me get this paperwork done? They might be able to do it, they might not be able to do it, but there's no stigma associated with me asking for that help. When an autistic individual asks for help, there is so often a stigma for them that's placed on them for asking for that help. So removing those stigmas. I'll go back to what I said at the beginning about the presumption of competence, that is somebody has the skill set, they have the ability to do what they need to do, they just need some supports to do it. And then there are everyday opportunities for someone to engage in advocacy or self-advocacy. It doesn't need to be at the Capitol. It doesn't need to be in an environment that's bigger than a one-to-one conversation. Self-advocacy begins when we're creating space for disabled and autistic individuals to engage. It's as simple as that. And it has to be done carefully and intentionally and all the time. My last slide is some resources that I wanted to share. Reach is us. That's our website. It's in the process of being made even better. So hang on for that. I wanted to share a lot of autistic-led organizations and resources. The Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, if you're not familiar, is a national organization that is doing some of the most incredible policy work for autistic individuals and for society in general. They also have some of the best examples of plain language resources on understanding benefits, understanding self-advocacy, understanding Medicaid, those kinds of things. Their resource page is really, really robust. They have a plain language guide to financial planning and financial management that is really great. The Employer Assistance Resource Network on Disability Inclusion has a page of resources that blew me away when I saw it. I was so impressed with how much they had for creating accessible work environments for not just autistic individuals, but for workers with disabilities. There are resources on inclusive education. There are resources on sibling supports. We talk a lot about autistic individuals, but their siblings need support as well. SIB Shops is a national network of sibling support groups for the non-disabled siblings of young people with all kinds of disabilities. There are great advocacy training opportunities. The North Texas Disability Chamber is another really great resource that's local. The rest of the resources on the right side of the page are things for people to watch. I talked a lot about the representation. Crip Camp is a film that is a documentary film that's on Netflix and is about the camp that was created in the 60s and 70s for young people with disabilities. It was created and run by disabled people. It highlights the early life of Judy Heumann, who passed away this past March, but was the Washington Post called her the grandmother of disability rights and a badass. That's a quote. So she's an amazing person who has since left us, and I'm still wrapping my head around that, but it's an amazing movie. Love on the Spectrum is another series on Netflix about autistic individuals in relationships. It's treated like a reality show, which is super cool. And then Atypical is another one. And then if you really want to have your paradigms rocked and really have some of your assumptions about people with disabilities challenged, I invite you to follow Open Future Learning on social media. They are all about normalizing disability as difference and normalizing supports as natural and nothing more than a further delineation of diversity. And they are irreverent and there's a lot of profanity. So if that's not something that you want in your world, then I will have given you that warning. But if you're okay with that, I encourage you to watch it because it's really great stuff. So I'm going to wrap up because it is time, and I don't know if there are any questions, but my contact information is at the end of the slide deck. I really appreciate the time to talk with everybody today, and thank you.
Wow, what a full day of resource-rich information, and I'm stealing that phrase from Jenny that she mentioned today. It really was. It's been great. Thank you all for joining us today, and many thanks to our speakers who have shared their valuable time with us. We appreciate you being here and sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. Before we end today's Watch Wellness workshop, I'd like to talk with you for just a moment about the online evaluation we mentioned this morning. Please take a moment to visit the link on your screen before leaving today's event to complete the evaluation. Please make note of the email you use when filling out the evaluation. When you submit your completed evaluation, a CEU certificate will be sent to the email address you have entered, so you can access it and print it later. We take your feedback seriously and use it to help plan the topics, speakers, themes, and format of our future workshops. We ask that you take a moment to complete the evaluation now. We will keep the Zoom session open until 1:30 to allow for networking. Please feel free to share any information about your organization in the chat. This can include the name, type of population you serve, if there's a resource or connection you are interested in making, etc. Again, thank you all for spending your time with us today. Have a great afternoon.
I was going to take just a couple seconds and speak to the question that was during my portion of the presentation about the average age of autism diagnosis for females. And I knew I had not come across it in my research and preparing for the presentation. And when I went back over lunch and like really kind of tried to dig it up, and there's actually something that needs to be updated in statistics, because the only thing I could find was from like 2015, and it separated out autism versus Asperger's, and it didn't seem like it would be very applicable today. But I think we can safely say probably that girls would be on the higher end of that 2 to 4 age range, if not above that range, would be my best guess.
I want to know what resources I can look into to get into labor and disability, that intersection in the workplace and working career-wise.
My contact information, the email, you would be more than welcome to reach out to me. I have all kinds of thoughts on it.
Okay, thank you.
Of
I
course.
really appreciated your sharing.
Yeah, happy to.
Thanks.
Wow, did you guys see Dr. Jarek's response? He and I attend, and so does Lindsay, attend a networking meeting once a month in Denton. So if we want to get Emily to reach out to him, I can give her his contact information.
That would be, yes. Yes, Dr. Jurek. Yes.
Yeah, we would love for you to be a part of this. We're going to put you to work, though.
Yeah, please get in touch with me. I appreciate it.
We will. We're happy that you're interested. And by the way, anybody else that's left on this call, if you're interested in being involved in our Denton County Watch Coalition, please reach out to one of us. We're happy to get you connected with Emily or Mandy. We would love the volunteers. There's always plenty of things to do.
Yes, join Watch.
And speaking of that, on the 20th of May, which is Saturday, the 20th, which is in 2 weeks, Watch does a Feelings Are a Work of Art contest, and we are going to have that gallery in person at the new courthouse in Denton on like I said, May 20th. I believe the time is from 11 in the morning till 2 in the afternoon. We'll award the winners of their category, and then also there'll be you can come out and do a people's choice voting if you would like, but we would love to have the anybody that's interested to come out and view what we're doing with that with school-age kids, and there'll be a few tables set up for resources and booths for the families as well. Okay, everybody, thank you to everyone that came, that participated. We appreciate your time and your attention. We appreciate you being here, and we hope to see you on the next workshop and possibly at the art gallery on the 20th. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody.